I grew up in a small town with a bizarre annual ritual. As I write this, I'm sobering up from the bender to end all benders. It would be safe to say that I finally hit rock bottom. For so many years I've attempted to drown my sorrows with alcohol, drugs, and one-night stands. But finally I've realized that I can't escape from my past and I must face the horror head-on. My entire adult life has been scarred by the trauma I suffered when I was 18 years old, when I lost everything and everyone, and was forced to flee from the town I called home. For the past 26 years I've been plagued with terrifying flashbacks, living under the dark shadow of PTSD and survivor's guilt. I've spoken to both priests and psychiatrists, but no one's been able to help me. The shrink told me I grew up in a cult and I need to realize what happened wasn't my fault. It's not that simple though. Yes, the community I was raised in was cut off from the rest of the world, and we did have a bizarre set of rules and rituals we were required to adhere to. But these traditions were not the creation of a crazed cultist on a power trip. In fact, they were very necessary for the survival of our community and kept our town safe for decades. That was until the fateful summer of 1998, when it all fell apart. Few will believe my account of these bizarre and bloody events. Most will think I am insane or delusional, and some might believe I'm trying to cover up my own complicity in these events. But I simply don't care anymore. I've kept this dark secret to myself for too long, and it's high time I revealed the truth. I'm writing this account now because it could be my last chance to do so. Because you see, I'm going back there, back to the ruins of the town I fled from over a quarter of a century ago. I am returning to face my demons. And I mean literal rather than metaphorical. The monster I am going to fight is a formidable foe, and I don't know whether I'll survive the battle to come. The dangers are great, but I have to do this. My very soul depends on it. Before I throw myself into the firing line, I'm going to tell you how it all began. The small and isolated rural town of Jericho was where I was born and raised, but you won't find it on any maps, not these days. Officially, the settlement was abandoned following a forest fire during the hot summer of '98. But that was simply a cover story invented by the authorities and media. I guess I can't blame them for the lie. No one would have believed the truth anyway. It's difficult describing our town's bizarre traditions to outsiders. The rules we lived under sound crazy, but to us growing up they made perfect sense. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you a little about my ill-fated town's history. The settlement was founded by a pioneer, and Jericho was established within the former territory of the Modoc Nation. But they had long since abandoned the lands around the mountain which they believed were cursed. Pastor White and his followers may well have heard the legends of the indigenous peoples, but no doubt wrote them off as foolish superstitions, because they settled under the shadow of the mountain and attempted to build a frontier community. The historical record of the next few years is sketchy and marked by gaps and conflicting accounts. What we know is that the town suffered terribly during its early years, and many settlers either died or went missing. The winters were harsh, but the summers were when the true horror was unleashed. The settlers weren't being picked off by indigenous warriors or the local wildlife. Instead, they fell victim to an ancient evil which dwelt in the mountain, a monster which hibernated throughout the year and emerged from its lair every summer to seek fresh prey. To this day, no one knows exactly what the monster is or where it originally came from, but all attempts to kill it have failed. What's more, the Modoc's tales of the beast in the mountain date back centuries. So, we've got to assume that it's immortal, or as close to being so that makes any difference. So, Pastor White and his flock had unwittingly built their settlement right bang in the middle of an immortal predator's hunting grounds. What would you do in this situation? Well, any sensible person would have run for the hills. They would have cut their losses and got what was left of their people the hell out of Dodge. But Pastor White was never going to do this. As his name and profession suggest, White was a deeply religious man, and the tragic events of those early years only increased his religious fervor until his beliefs reached fanatical levels. The pastor wrote extensively during this time, and his journals became the basis for the quasi-religion which ultimately took a hold of our town. It's been many years since my religious education, and Young's original writings have long since been burnt to ashes. Therefore, I can't recall the exact text of the pastor's holy book, but I remember extracts and quotes. Looking back, I realized these were half-deranged ramblings of a fanatic. There was much talk of a new prophecy, a test from God. and a life and death battle against the satanic spawn which dwelt in the mountain. Most important, however, were the 5 rules or new commandments laid down by the pastor and the annual ritual he set in place. But I'll get to those later. I'll have to give Franklin White credit, though. Despite his many faults, he and his most loyal followers led the fight back against the monster. They soon learned it was impossible to kill the beast, but it could be wounded and weakened by bullets and blades. They fought running battles with the monster throughout the forest and forced it back up onto the mountain. The cost was heavy, as many settlers died during the fighting. The creature they fought was strong and capable of great deceptions. But in the end, White and his fighters were victorious, as they pushed the monster back and trapped it, thus saving the town from certain destruction. Naturally, White credited God for the victory, but he also proclaimed himself as a holy prophet tasked with defending Jericho and its chosen people from the demon that dwelt in the mountain. But true evil never dies, and the monster would always threaten Jericho and its people. The only hope was to contain the beast, to keep it weak and trapped so it could never again descend upon the town and slaughter our people. This is why Pastor White instituted the annual ritual, so the evil he fought could be secured and contained long after his death. I'll speak about the specifics of the ritual in due course, but first I must complete my quickfire history of the town. The ritual established by our town's founder was in place for over 130 years, from 1866 to 1997. During this time, the ritual only failed once. The terrible summer of 1942 was enshrined in our upbringing and education during my youth. Many of our young men were drafted to fight in World War II, and those left behind got complacent. It's a long and complicated story, but the bottom line is that the beast escaped from its sealed lair and once again launched a deadly assault upon the town of Jericho. 13 people died in the subsequent rampage, and much of the eastern side of the town was burnt to the ground. Eventually, the monster was driven back up to the mountain, but the devastation wreaked upon our community was not forgotten, and it would be a long time before anyone questioned the ritual again. By the time I came of age, there was only one survivor of the 42 disaster still living in our town, and that was Gary Baker. Gary had obtained a near legendary status in the community by the 90s, having led the fight back in 1942 when he was a mere teenager. By the summer of 1998, Jerry was in his early 70s but still had a fearsome reputation, living alone in a wood cabin on the very edge of the Forbidden Zone and playing a leading role in the annual ritual for over 5 decades. I both feared and respected old Jerry when I was growing up, and it pains me to remember what happened to him. And then, there's my story. For what it's worth. My first name is Benjamin, but that's all you'll get from me. Suffice to say, I am a 4th-generation Jericho resident, and so should have been an established and respected member of the community. But unfortunately, this wasn't always the case. A cloud of suspicion hung over me throughout my childhood, all for something that wasn't my fault. My mother got pregnant with me while she was still in her teens and outside of wedlock. This would have been scandal enough for a small religious community, but the real problem lay with my father. He'd just turned 18 and was selected by lottery to participate in the annual ritual during the summer of 1979. But, for whatever reason, my father didn't go through with it. He skipped town the night before the ritual was due to begin and never came back, also leaving my pregnant mother behind. Abandoning the mother of his unborn son would have been bad enough, but the real shame was abandoning the community and failing to fulfill his sacred duty. For this reason, my father was considered a coward and traitor in our town. None of this was my mom's fault, let alone mine, but we were the ones left behind to deal with the aftermath of my father's actions. My mother never fully recovered from the betrayal and as a result developed a drinking problem, ultimately becoming something close to a pariah in our town. As for me, my childhood was difficult. I won't go as far to say that I was ostracized in our community, but I felt there was always a question mark hanging over me. Other kids would bully me, and even the adults would whisper behind my back, asking whether the apple hadn't fallen far from the tree, and wondering if my father's treacherous blood ran through my veins. Undoubtedly, this treatment had an impact on me. I always felt like I had something to prove, and that can be a dangerous thing. Let me take you back to the eve of the summer solstice in 1998, the day before hell was unleashed upon our unsuspecting town. I was attending the annual ceremony in our church hall, sitting amongst my friends and neighbors. This night was the busiest of the year, and the church was packed to the rafters, with latecomers forced to stand in the aisles or at the rear. Practically the entire town was here, with a few notable exceptions, including my own mother. She preferred the company of the bottle rather than the warmth and solidarity of our community. This irked me no end, but I tried not to think about my mom in that moment. Instead, I was focused upon what could be the most important night of my life, as I finally had the opportunity to prove my worth and erase the stain of my father's treachery. I was sitting in the third row from the front alongside the Andersons, who were effectively my surrogate family. Nathan had been my best friend since I was 4 years old, and he sat beside me on that night, a cheeky smile on his lips and his eyes lit up with a mischievous glint. That's how I like to remember him, the true Nathan. Before we were hit by all the sorrow and suffering, Nathan appeared laid back and confident on that night, but I knew how nervous he was, because I felt the same way. But Nathan and I were like brothers, and we'd face this challenge together. Nathan's father sat on the pew beside his son, Paul Anderson, who just happened to be our town's sheriff. Sheriff Paul had become a surrogate father to me over the years, taking on the role of making me into a man. I don't know where I would have ended up without his guidance and support. He turned towards me in that moment, smiling thinly and nodding his head in reassurance. This mere nod gave me confidence, because I knew Sheriff Paul had my back. And finally, there was Jessica, Nathan's twin sister, who sat at the end of the row. I stared longingly at her for a moment, admiring her long dark hair, sparkling green eyes, soft unblemished skin, and of course her voluptuous and gorgeous body. She caught me looking, shooting me a sweet smile and knowing wink. I smiled back, but then quickly looked away, afraid that either Nathan or his father would pick up on the chemistry between us. But thankfully neither of them noticed. My feelings for Jessica had complicated my relationship with the Anderson family, and I knew this was a problem I'd ultimately need to confront, but not on that night. The large congregation was being addressed by Pastor Eddie White, the town's current preacher. As his name would suggest, Pastor Eddie was a descendant of our town's founder and was prone to similar flights of fanaticism, although he lacked the charisma, courage, and leadership skills of his late ancestor. He stood upon the altar at the front of his church, dressed in white robes and looking down upon the town folk with nervous eyes and a fake smile plastered across his plump face. His wife Yasmin was sitting in the front row, grinning enthusiastically under her blonde wig, her blue eyes focused upon her husband as she prepared for his sermon. Eddie and Yasmin White liked to think they ran the town, but the sheriff and the mayor were the true leaders of this community, and they kept the Whites in line. The mayor's name was Dan Cooper, and he sat on the front row on the other side of the aisle alongside his wife Teresa and children Peter and Amy. His son Peter was only 12 and so too young to be selected for the ritual, where the minimum age was 18 and only males were eligible for the draft. There was much excited conversation and murmuring amongst the tightly packed congregation as all present speculated about the coming sermon and of course the ritual scheduled for the next day. The pastor spoke through the microphone attached to his podium and asked for silence. Some listened and stopped talking, but others either didn't hear the pastor or ignored his request. Nathan and I both sniggered as we took a perverse pleasure from the pastor's embarrassment, but one hard look from the sheriff was enough to shut us up. Meanwhile, the pastor made yet another appeal for silence, but to no avail. In the end, the mayor needed to stand up from the pews and face the crowd, motioning to the congregation and instantly gaining their compliance. A moment later, and all the hushed chatter in the hall melted away. The fake smile on the pastor's face never wavered, but I saw the angry look he shot the mayor before he continued. Clearly, Eddie was jealous of the respect the mayor garnered amongst the townsfolk. Nevertheless, he began his sermon and the congregation listened. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. What a pleasure to see so many of you here on this glorious night. When I look out upon you all now, I am filled with hope and joy, because I see that the faith and traditions of our town are still as strong as ever, and with God on our side, we will surely prevail. There followed a round of enthusiastic applause before the pastor continued. When my ancestor established this town, he was tested by the Lord. He and the first pioneers faced a huge challenge when they were forced to fight against an evil risen from the depths of hell. This mission was dangerous and arduous, but with God's will, My ancestor succeeded against all the odds. Another round of applause followed before Pastor White got on to the next part. Pastor Franklin White not only saved our town from the beast, he also gave us the tools and the systems to keep the demon at bay, from now until the end of days. The good Lord gave us 10 commandments to live by, delivered to Moses on Mount Sinai. And, before my ancestor passed over, he left us with 5 rules, as if on cue. We all stood up from our pews and began to recite Franklin White's 5 commandments. They were displayed on the wall behind the altar, but I think everyone present knew the rules off by heart. Hell, it's been 26 years and I still remember them word by word. 1. Do not walk alone through the woods after nightfall. Even when the beast is contained, it still holds power over the darkness. 2. No one is permitted to enter the forbidden zone unless conducting official church business or participating in the annual ritual. 3. Without exception, the ritual must take place every year before the summer solstice. 4. The ritual master takes responsibility for ensuring the plan is successfully executed. All selected must follow his orders. 5. In the event of a ritual failure, all the townsfolk must report to the church hall to coordinate the community's defense. And that was it. The 5 rules which must be followed to keep Jericho safe. It sounds simple, right? Right? Well, on that night, Pastor White was all too quick to remind us of the consequences when the rules weren't adhered to, lest we forget the terrible summer of 1942. Never again, people. Never again. A solemn silence ensued as the pastor's ominous warning sunk in. But White was more upbeat when he reached the next section of his sermon. Well, folks, we've covered the essentials. But now let's get to the main event. There was a further round of applause from the crowd as well as excited murmurs. I looked to Nathan, and he met my gaze. This was the moment we'd been waiting for. It almost seems ridiculous looking back now, but at the time we both thought this was the defining event of our lives. I nodded my head and slapped my friend on the back, and we silently waited for the first announcement. 2 parishioners brought forward a top hat, inside of which were several crunched up pieces of paper. The pastor took hold of the hat and placed it on top of the podium before speaking into the microphone once again. To assist me in the selections, I'm going to call my beloved and beautiful wife to the stage, the pastor announced. Yasmin was beaming as she stood up from her pew and confidently made her way to the stage in her high heels. She continued to smile as she stood by her husband's side, rummaged through the hat, and picked out a small piece of paper. We were all on the edge of our seats by this point. You could have heard a pin drop in that church hall, and the tension was almost unbearable as we watched Yasmin hand the paper to her husband. There followed another tense moment before the preacher read the name aloud. Nathan Anderson. My best friend couldn't control his emotions as he shouted yes, and punched the air in joyous celebration. I smiled and gave Nathan a high five. His father shook his boy's hand and the rest of the townsfolk clapped in respectful congratulations. Although I noted Jessica didn't look happy, as she screwed her face up in annoyance. Well done, young Nathan, the pastor announced. We know you won't let us down. I felt a mixture of emotions in that moment. I was happy for my best friend, of course, but also worried, because I wanted so badly to be there by his side. But there was no guarantee my lot would be picked. There was a lump in my throat as I watched the pastor's wife pick a second name and hand it to her husband. I saw Pastor White's smile fade as he frowned and read the second name my name. I was in a state of shock, barely believing what I'd just heard. The response from the crowd was lukewarm. A few people applauded, but others let out shocked gasps and disapproving murmurs. But Nathan and his dad were ecstatic. My best friend whooped for a second time and embraced me in a bear hug. And that's when it hit home. I'd wanted so badly to redeem my family name in this town, but now it was real, and I felt the heavy burden of responsibility on my young shoulders. The sermon continued, but I couldn't focus on the pastor's words as my head was filled with the implications of my selection. I wanted to get out of that church hall and away from the prying eyes and hushed whispers. Finally, the ceremony ended and we were let go. Tomorrow was the big day, and everyone wanted to get home to prepare, but not Nathan and me. We were too excited and needed to go somewhere to unwind. Jessica came with us, much to Nathan's annoyance but to my secret relief. I hoped I would have the opportunity to speak with her alone at some point in the evening. The 3 of us headed out of the church and walked across town to the old boathouse by the lakeside. That's where we regularly went to chill and enjoy our small stash of booze and pot. A secret that we obviously kept from Nathan and Jessica's dad. But before we reached our sanctuary, we were confronted by Billy and Randy, a couple of nasty town bullies who were in our year in school. Both had long been rivals of Nathan and me. The bullies blocked our path down Main Street, sneering and shouting abuse from the sidewalk with cold spite in their eyes. The boys were bitter because they hadn't been selected for the ritual, even though the draw was entirely random. "Hey, here come the assholes now," cried out Billy. Randy sneered cruelly before joining the tirade. "That draw was bullshit. We all know it's a fix. The sheriff's boy gets the top gig, nobody buys it." Nathan could sometimes be a hothead, but on this occasion he played it cool, simply laughing in Randy's face as he replied, "Whatever, man." My friend replied, "You believe whatever you want. And don't worry, I'm sure your names will come up next year." It was the right response. But unfortunately, Randy and Billy weren't backing down, as they moved in closer and blocked us off. "And you?" Billy scowled whilst pointing aggressively towards me. "They're going to let the traitor's son on the ritual." What a goddamn joke. I tried to swallow my anger but couldn't help but spit out my angry rebuttal. "Go to hell, Billy. That's where we'll all be going once you guys screw it up. Still, I guess I shouldn't worry. Benjamin's just going to run away like his old man. Cowardice runs in his family." I gritted my teeth and clenched my fists. But it was Jessica who stepped forward and spoke in my defense. "You leave Ben alone," she said whilst marching forward to confront the bullies. "He's a great guy and nothing like his daddy." Billy snarled and looked down upon Jessica with contempt before spitting out his hateful reply. "Hey bitch, men are talking here. Keep your damn trap shut." Jessica reacted with predictable fury, her face turning red as she charged forward and slapped Billy hard across his face. "Screw you," she screamed. As Billy reeled in shock, Randy responded instinctively to the attack against his friend, darting forward and grabbing at Jessica. I wasn't having this, however, as I moved in between the two and physically shoved Randy down to the sidewalk. A moment later, and Billy recovered from the slap and clenched his fists in preparation for a fight. But this time Nathan intervened, stepping forward with fury in his eyes as he snarled his words through clenched teeth. "Touch my sister and I'll break your goddamn nose." Billy knew that Nathan meant it, and I could see the fear in the bully's eyes as he retreated. A moment later, Billy helped his friend up off the sidewalk and they ran away down the street, although Billy cried out a parting threat as they went. "Fuck you guys. You'll get what's coming to you." And then they sprinted around the block and disappeared from sight. Nathan and Jessica were still upset and angry after the confrontation, and it was left up to me to calm them down. "Screw those assholes," I said with a smile on my face. "Come on, guys. Let's get high." 10 minutes later and we were holed up in the old boathouse, ignoring the damp as we sipped on warm beers and passed around a fat joint. The alcohol and weed helped take the edge off, and the three of us were able to relax and chat. "Those guys are freaking idiots," Nathan proclaimed confidently. "They won't say shit to us after tomorrow. We'll be like kings in this town." I laughed nervously before trying to bring my friend back down to earth. "Come on, man. We're mainly there to observe and learn how the ritual works. It's not such a big deal." It was a big deal to me, of course, but I didn't want to sound too arrogant in front of Jessica. Nevertheless, the girl responded with mocking laughter. "Come on, guys. Let's have a reality check here," she exclaimed after taking a long drag on the joint. "This is all BS and you both know it. What the hell are you talking about?" Nathan answered in annoyance. "Just think about it. Have you ever seen the beast in the mountain?" "Do you know anyone who's ever seen it?" she asked. "Jerry Baker's seen it," I replied defensively. "Oh yeah, you're going to believe that crazy old coot," Jessica replied. "Remember how he chased us out of the woods when we were kids?" I did remember, and I was scared shitless of old Jerry when we were younger. "We were breaking the rules," I replied meekly. "Yeah, the rules. The ceremony. The ritual which only men are allowed to participate in. They've got this entire system to keep us in our place, to keep us living in fear so we never question the people in charge." "So, what are you saying, sis?" Nathan interrupted. "You reckon the monster doesn't exist?" Jessica shrugged her shoulders dismissively before passing the joint to me. "Maybe there was something up there originally, a bear or a cougar. or something. But not now. It's just a myth that the town's leaders kept going all these years. This is the 1990s, for God's sake. Do you really think they could keep this a secret from the rest of the world? Nathan and I looked at each other as doubts crept into our minds. Could Jessica be right? Was this all a lie constructed by the town elders? I didn't know what to say. But Nathan spoke out to challenge his sister. You're full of crap, Jess. The monster's real and everyone knows it. And we're going up there tomorrow to save our town. Oh, okay, Nathan, she shot back. I get it. You want to be the big man who saves the day. Is that it? No. Nathan spat back angrily. I'm doing this for Mom. Jessica didn't have any answer to that, as she broke off eye contact and lowered her head in shame. Nathan and Jessica's mother was a wonderful woman called Patricia who'd looked after me when my own mom was on the booze. She'd passed away from breast cancer 2 years before. The whole family had been devastated, but Nathan had taken the loss particularly hard. My friend had been in danger of going off the rails before we got him back on track. It was clear now why the ritual meant so much to him. He wanted to do his part to honor his mother's legacy and protect the town she loved so much. A somber silence hung in the air for a long moment, and no one said a word. Once again, it was left to me to speak up. Well, guys, we best head on. It's a big day tomorrow, and we'll all need to get some sleep. Yeah, you're right, man, said Nathan, as he got up and slapped me on the back. You're coming home with us, right? He asked me. No, man. I need to go home and talk with my mom. Nathan frowned, pulling a face in sympathy. Geez, buddy, that's going to be fun, he said sarcastically before leaving the hut. Jessica and I were left alone for a moment, and we took advantage of the opportunity, moving close and engaging each other in a passionate kiss. Good luck with your mom, Jessica said sympathetically as she looked into my eyes. If it's too much, come and stay with us tonight. I will, I replied. We were both worried that Nathan would become suspicious, and so Jessica and I broke off our embrace and exited the boathouse, joining my friend as we walked out into the warm summer's night. I was sluggish during my walk home, taking my time as I mentally prepared myself for the difficult encounter to come. In the end, I plucked up the courage and faced the music, shaking my head in disgust as I walked past our overgrown lawn and approached the dilapidated bungalow where I'd grown up. The paint on the door was peeling, and the steps leading up to our porch creaked. The whole place was on the verge of falling apart. I'd spent much of my early teens trying to look after my mom in the house, working part-time jobs after school and spending my evenings trying to get her sober. However, I'd long since given this up as a lost cause, spending most of my time with the Andersons and only visiting occasionally to check my mother was still alive. I used to hate her for all she'd put me through growing up. But now, after all these years, I can understand her situation somewhat better. But, on that night, I just wanted to tell Mom my news and go straight to bed, although I doubted I would get off so easily. I opened the front door after struggling with the rusted lock and made my way to the litter-strewn living room, where I found my mother passed out on the couch with an empty vodka bottle on the floor beside her. I sighed aloud and rolled my eyes, disappointed but not surprised. Next, I went through the all-too-familiar routine of sitting my mother up and trying to shake her awake. Part of me hoped I'd be unable to rouse her. Perhaps she'd sleep right through to lunchtime tomorrow and would miss the ritual altogether. But alas, I wasn't that lucky. My mom eventually woke up, slowly opening her bloodshot eyes and groggily taking in her surroundings. She looked up at me and I retreated as I smelt the strong smell of alcohol on her breath. Well, she said with a croaky voice. Look who's decided to show their face. Jesus, Mom, I replied in disgust. How much have you had to drink? What do you care? She shot back defensively while sitting up on the couch. It's not like you're ever here anyway. Too busy with your new and improved family, I reckon. I ignored the obvious attempted guilt trip and moved on. Listen, Mom, I've got something to tell you. Oh yeah, she replied. Her interest now piqued. Yeah, I said sheepishly. It was the ceremony tonight. Remember? My mother thought for a moment, surely fighting off a headache as she tried to think. Oh yeah, that bullshit. I guess it's been a year already. My mother hadn't attended the church in many years, I made a deliberate point of avoiding the annual ceremony at all costs. I took a deep breath before continuing. Yes, Mom. It's that time of year. You know that I'm 18 now and eligible for selection. And guess what? I got picked. I'm going on the ritual, Mom. I don't know exactly how I expected my mother to react to this news. The most likely outcome was probably indifference or mockery, although a small part of me still hoped she'd be proud of me. But what I didn't expect was the fury in her voice as her face turned red and her eyes bulged. No. You're not doing it. They're not taking my boy, not a chance in hell. She screamed. I was truly shocked by her angry tirade and left utterly confused. What are you talking about, Mom? I'm going to do my duty for the town. Fuck the town, was her foul-mouthed rebuttal. You need to run, Benjamin. Get out of town tonight. And never come back. Now it was my turn to be furious as the sheer hypocrisy of her words hit home. What the hell, Mom? You want me to run away like a coward, just like Dad did? You've always hated him for leaving. No, she corrected. I hated him for leaving us behind. He was right to get out of this damn town and away from those maniacs in the church. Monster or not. These people are dangerous. You need to get away from them, son, before it's too late. I shook my head vigorously, tears in my eyes as I spluttered my reply. No, Mother. I won't turn my back on my friends and neighbors. I'm going to do my duty, and you can't stop me. Her eyes filled up with anger as she sat up from her chair and stood upon shaking legs. Instinctively, I knew that violence was coming, and so began retreating towards the doorway. My mother's fury didn't falter as she picked up the empty vodka bottle and flung it at me. I ducked just in the nick of time, and the bottle narrowly missed my head and smashed against the living room wall. Get the hell out then, my mother screamed. Go to the damn Andersons and do the sheriff's dirty work. Just don't come crying to me once it all turns to shit. I tearfully glanced into my mother's hateful eyes before fleeing from my childhood home and slamming the door behind me. After the fight, I went straight to the Andersons' house and was welcomed with open arms. I slept in their spare room that night, as I'd done so many times before. But in truth, I got little rest, as the events of the day dominated my thoughts. When I did eventually drift off due to sheer exhaustion, my dreams were filled with terrifying images of the dark mountain and terrible disembodied screams which reverberated through the forest. And blood, so much blood. I was already awake by the time the first lights of dawn crept through my bedroom curtain. Sheriff Paul knocked on my door, telling me it was time to get up. I took a deep breath, staring up at the ceiling for a moment as I considered my options. My mother's harsh words had put doubts in my mind, but I had to dismiss them. I owed the Andersons so much and couldn't let them down at this late hour. I sat up from my bed and put on my jeans before heading for the bathroom. I met Jessica in the corridor en route. She was still wearing her night clothes and showing a decent amount of cleavage and skin. Naturally, this awoke certain feelings in me as I thought back to our night of secret passion only a month before. Jessica looked hurt as she confronted me in the hallway, whispering so not to be heard by her father and brother. You didn't come to me last night, she said sadly. I know, I said, as I put my hand on her shoulder and looked her in the eye. I wanted to. Really, I did. It's just everything with my mom. And what if they caught us? Jessica tutted and rolled her eyes. For God's sake, Ben, we're both 18. They can't stop us from seeing each other. It's time we told Daddy and my brother the truth. We will. I said whilst looking over my shoulder. But not until after the ritual. She let out an exasperated gasp and shook her head. Seriously, Ben, you still believe it's real? I don't know what to believe, I replied honestly. I just know that I can't let everyone down. I need to go through with this. Jessica wasn't happy, but she seemed to understand. We embraced briefly and kissed before I heard Nathan climbing out of his bed, and then we broke away. We left about half an hour later. Sheriff Paul prepared breakfast for us, but I could hardly eat a bite due to my nerves. Jessica didn't believe the ritual was real, but she held her tongue, hugging the three of us and wishing us good luck. Our embrace went on for just a little too long, and I think her father noticed. But he didn't say anything in that moment. The mayor came to meet us, driving up to the Andersons' place in his beloved classic Ford Mustang. He smiled amicably as he exited the car, showing all the charm and charisma which had gotten him elected for 3 terms in a row. We all exchanged pleasantries before changing into our hunting gear and arming ourselves with rifles and spare ammunition. The mayor tried to reassure Nathan and I, saying that the guns were just a precaution and it was unlikely we'd have to use them. The 4 of us piled into Sheriff Paul's station wagon, the mayor and sheriff in the front with Nathan and me in the back. Meanwhile, Jessica drove herself to the police station, where her father wanted her to wait until the all-clear signal. And so we set off, driving up the mountain road and through the dense redwood forest. Spirits were high at first as we talked and joked through the first few miles, but the tension grew as we got closer to the extinct volcano. Like a dark cloud was cast over our small party. We drove in silence for the last leg of the car journey as the gravity of our situation hit home. I was very nervous, and I'm sure Nathan felt the same. I wondered whether this was what young soldiers experienced when they went off to war. Nathan and I were the fresh recruits, while the mayor and sheriff were the veterans leading us into battle. We trusted them with our lives, and it never occurred to me that they'd intentionally put us in danger. Our car left the main road and traversed the dirt track which led up to the old Baker place, located at the foot of Mount Rapture, and on the very edge of the Forbidden Zone. We drove up slowly, only to find Jerry sitting on the front porch of his small cabin, a rifle resting on his lap and 5 backpacks carefully laid out before him. He wore a checkered lumberjack shirt and blue jeans. His hair was gray and face weathered, but he had a thunderous look in his dark eyes as he watched us approach. I felt a cold chill running through me, as I remembered the fear this man had evoked in me during my childhood. The sheriff pulled up and parked in front of the cabin. We exited the car, only to receive a cool welcome from Jerry. "About time you guys got here," he said sarcastically. The mayor didn't rise to it, however, retaining her friendly smile as he approached the cabin. "Good morning, Gary. How are you on this glorious day?" Jerry scoffed dismissively. "I'm ready to get this job done," he answered firmly. Jerry got up from his bench and looked down upon Nathan and I with obvious contempt. "So, these are the pups you brought? Funny. It's not long ago I caught these little jerks trying to sneak into the Forbidden Zone." I froze, thinking back to that day Gary found us and the severe punishment we'd received. I couldn't meet Jerry's gaze as his angry glare cut through me. Luckily, the mayor was able to laugh it off as he answered in a jovial tone. Now, Jerry, that was a long time ago, and we all do stupid things when we're young. Nathan and Benjamin are men now, and they're here to do their duty." Jerry bellowed laughter in open mockery. "Men. That's what you call them. I was younger than those boys during the summer of '42. Your generation has no damn idea. I've been holding the line for over 50 years, and I'm sick of it. Come on, Jerry." The mayor shot back as his patience began to waver. "We've talked about your retirement many times. Arrangements are in place for the handover. Well, let me tell you right now, Mr. Mayor, this is my last year doing this shit." "Okay, Gary, we'll talk about it once we're done. Now, shall we get going?" Each one of us grabbed hold of a backpack before we set off on foot. The bags were heavy and I asked what was inside them. Gary wouldn't say but warned us not to drop them. We walked in single file under the tall trees, barely speaking as the tension slowly grew. I recall Gary mentioning whenever we crossed the invisible line that marked the edge of the Forbidden Zone. I'm not sure how he recognized it, but I guess Gary knew the territory like the back of his hand. I would definitely say the atmosphere got more tense once we crossed the boundary. At first I thought it was psychological. I'd never been out this far after all. But as we continued our silent march, I realized there was something else, something darker. It took me several minutes to realize it. But there were no sounds in this part of the forest, no bird songs or chirps from small creatures. Nothing. The entire area seemed devoid of life, with only the tall trees above us with sunlured sunlight breaking through the thick canopy. But before long we walked past the treeline and reached the foot of the mountain, walking slowly towards a cave entrance blocked by a substantial pile of heavy rocks and boulders. It didn't look like much at first glance, but I could see from the behavior of my elders how significant this landmark was. "What is this?" Nathan asked nervously. "This is where the monsters hold up," Gary answered solemnly, "or rather where it's trapped. Come on, let's take a closer look." I didn't want to approach the cave entrance. Every instinct in my body told me to run in the opposite direction. but there was no way I could back down now. Once we got in close, I could see the cave wasn't entirely blocked up. There was a small gap between two heavy boulders, just about big enough for a single person to squeeze through. Jerry was more conciliatory as he explained the situation to Nathan and me. The beast is weak right now. It's been 50-odd years since he last had a good meal. But there are creatures which live in the caves, rodents and the like, and it feeds upon them throughout the year, building up just enough strength to help him dig. He paused and pointed to the gap. In another day or two, the bastard would find its way out, but it's our job to prevent this. Now, set your backpacks down carefully and open them up. We did as instructed, and I was astonished to find my bag filled with explosive charges, dynamite sticks with blast caps attached to a command wire. Nathan looked up from his own bag and met my gaze, his eyes bulging as he mouthed, "What the fuck?" "Okay, let's get to work," Gary said. We followed his instructions carefully as we placed charges around the cave's entrance and linked them up to the detonator. This process took some time, and there were various corrections to the setup as Gary barked out his orders. I noticed how even the mayor and sheriff adhered to his instructions in this regard. We were all sweating under the mid-morning sun by the time the job was done. Nathan spoke out after we had set the charges. "What, is that it?" he exclaimed in near disbelief. "We're just going to blow it up." "What did you expect?" Gary shot back. "I don't know." Nathan answered with a shrug of his shoulders. "I always thought there would be some sort of magic or epic battle, not this. The simplest plan is usually the best." The sheriff answered firmly. "Pay attention, son. Someday it will be you leading this ritual." I was surprised too. Was it really that simple? I didn't know what was in the cave. If anything, I was creeped out for sure, but I did wonder whether Jessica had been right all along. Perhaps this was all a hoax. Maybe we'd just cause a cave-in and block the entrance of any empty cavern. "Well, let's get this over with," said Jerry. "Would you care to do the honors, Gary?" The mayor asked to read the words one last time. "No," Gary answered with a sneer. "Words are your fort, Mr. Mayor." "Be my guest." "Very well," he replied. "Sheriff, please can you push the plunger when the time comes?" The sheriff confirmed with a silent nod of his head and took up position. Meanwhile, the mayor spoke without referring to any notes, beginning as so. "Our Lord in heaven, we stand here today as soldiers of Christ, our hearts filled with the Holy Spirit as we prepare to do battle against this great evil. As with our forefathers before us," he never got the chance to finish his little speech, because the ritual was suddenly interrupted by a new voice. A female voice which echoed from inside of the cave. We all froze, not believing what we were hearing. But then the mysterious voice called out again. "Hello? Is there anybody there? Please. I need help." The voice sounded eerily familiar, but it was Nathan who made the connection first. "Mom?" He spluttered out emotionally. I looked to my friend and saw tears forming in his eyes as his whole body trembled. "Nathan? Honey? Please help me, I'm trapped down here." The disembodied voice was definitely coming from the gap between the boulders. Although I could see nothing but darkness on the far side, I didn't know what the hell was going on. "It's a trick," Gary shouted as a warning. "Don't listen to him." I looked back to Sheriff Paul and found him paralyzed, his eyes wide with shock as he stood over the plunger. "It doesn't make sense," muttered the mayor. "The beast cannot mimic human voices. There's no precedent, damn it." "Dan," Gary cried in frustration. "It can learn. He'll use any trick he can to escape." The mayor shook his head and said, "It isn't possible." Then the voice called out again, louder this time. "Nathan, baby, please. I don't have much time." I looked to my friend and saw something snap inside of him, as he ignored all common sense, dropped his rifle, and sprinted forward. "I'm coming, Mom," he cried. "Nathan, no," I screamed as I reached out to tackle him. But it was too late. Nathan sprinted past me and climbed into the hole, soon forcing his way inside of the cave. "God damn it," screamed Gary. He turned to the sheriff and shouted out his orders. "The kid's done for. Detonate the charges." This brought the sheriff back to reality as he cried out in dismay. "Are you crazy? That's my boy in there." "You damn fool," Jerry exclaimed. "You'll kill us all." The old man charged forward and dove towards the plunger. There was a struggle as the sheriff desperately tried to stop him from detonating the explosives. Suddenly, a shot rang out and Jerry fell screaming, clutching a bullet wound in his thigh. Sheriff Paul was left standing there with a smoking revolver in his hand, and the mayor still did nothing, remaining frozen to the spot as he kept muttering, "This can't be happening." Suddenly, there was a blood-curdling scream from inside of the cave. I recognized it instantly. Nathan was crying out, and he was in trouble. The sheriff shouted out his son's name and ran forward. He started climbing through the gap but didn't get far. I heard a sharp scream followed by the terrible sound of something biting into flesh. The sheriff's legs were still outside of the cave. They kicked frantically for a few seconds before going motionless, and a second later his body was dragged inside. I was in a state of shock, my panicked brain unable to comprehend the horrors I was witnessing. It was Gary who broke me from my panic-induced trance. The old man was bleeding out from the bullet wound in his leg, but he still had strength enough to call out, "Kid, the beast is feeding. It's gaining strength. You need to push the plunger. It's our only hope." I nodded my head and started running towards the plunger, but it was already too late. There was a huge explosion behind me, but it wasn't caused by the charges we'd set. Instead, the blast came from the other side. As the boulders blocking the entrance were propelled outwards, I was thrown off my feet, losing my rifle in the process. And when I looked over to where the mayor had been standing, I saw he'd been hit by a rock, his skull crushed by the sheer velocity of the impact. Finally, I turned towards the now open cave entrance and saw the beast for the first time. It was horrific. The monster stood at least 8 foot tall, its naked skin as pale as milk and with giant, folded wings attached to its back. I noted the long and sharp claws attached to its webbed feet and hands, all of which appeared more than capable of ripping through human flesh. Its head was that of a man, but its eyes were jet black, like those of a shark, and its lipless mouth was formed into a wicked approximation of a smile, a sadistic grin which showed off its sharpened fangs, while the fresh blood of the Anderson men dripped from its hideous maw. I saw what I was up against and realized I stood no chance. To my great shame, I broke and fled back towards the treeline, but I wasn't the beast's target. Once I reached the relative safety of the forest, I ducked down behind the foliage and watched as the beast slowly approached the stricken dairy baker with a murderous glint in its black eyes. To his credit, Jerry remained defiant and heroic right to the very end. He drew a knife from his belt and attempted to pull himself up while shouting, "You ugly son of a bitch. I beat your ass once, and I can do it again." The beast let out a hateful cackle as it easily kicked the knife from Jerry's hand and knocked him back down to the ground. Jerry cried out in pain but soon accepted his fate, saying, "Okay, put me out of my misery, you bastard." The beast roared like a lion, opening its gaping maw and unleashing a stream of fire from the back of its throat, engulfing the screaming Gary in a horrifying inferno. Mercifully, it was over quickly. As the old man's body was burnt to cinders in mere seconds, I covered my mouth and retched once the stench of burnt flesh hit my nostrils. And then I turned away from the bloody scene and fled deeper into the woods as the monster's roar once again filled the air. I somehow made it back to the sheriff's station wagon parked at old Jerry's cabin, only to realize I didn't have the keys. I thought on my feet, gaining access to the late Jerry's house and eventually finding the keys to his old Jeep Wrangler. The engine started on the 3rd attempt, and I sped down the mountain road, determined to warn my neighbors of the coming danger. He woke up with wings, but as I drove, I once again heard the monster's blood-curdling roar, and when I looked up, I saw the beast in full flight and heading straight for the near-defenseless town of Jericho. I drove to the strip mall off Main Street, slamming the brakes on the Jeep and coming to an abrupt stop in the empty parking lot. All of the stores were closed and boarded up as was the usual precaution on the day of the ritual. Only one unit had any signs of life, and that was the sheriff's office at the end of the row. I paused for a moment, my hands still grasping the steering wheel as suddenly all my emotions spilled out at once. I screamed as tears ran down my cheeks and I slammed my fists against the dashboard. It wasn't supposed to go like this. No one was meant to die. For 50 years the ritual had gone without a hitch, but everything had gone to hell in one short morning. My best friend, his father and 2 others were dead, and I couldn't process it. But this wasn't the time for grieving. The beast was coming, assuming it wasn't already here. I couldn't do anything for Nathan and the other casualties, but I could still save the others. Jessica was my priority, and my mother too. I had to get them somewhere safe before it was too late. Pulling myself together, I jumped out of the vehicle and jogged across the asphalt, wearily looking up into the sky but seeing it was all clear. I burst into the sheriff's office and surprised the 3 persons inside. The 2 part-time deputies, Tanya and Mike, both jumped up whenever they saw me. I noticed how they both reached for their holsters, but the cops calmed down once they recognized me, and sitting at the back of the station room was Jessica. She was flicking through a magazine when I burst in, but her eyes lit up once she saw me. I noted how her expression changed in an instant as she picked up on my obvious distress. We both stood frozen for a long moment, and I couldn't find the words. How could I tell Jessica that her father and brother were dead? That I just stood and watched while they were slaughtered? In the end, it was Tanya who broke the silence, as she approached and placed a firm hand on my shoulder, asking, "Are you okay, kid?" I flinched at her touch, pulling away and reacting with anger. "No. I'm not fucking okay," I shouted. She frowned but didn't lose her patience. "What happened, kid?" Tanya asked sternly. I opened my mouth but found the words stuck in my throat. Eventually, I managed to splutter out what felt like a confession. The ritual failed. It's got loose. I saw Tanya's eyes widen in terror at the news, although her reaction wasn't as bad as her partner's. Mike, the second deputy, flew into an instant panic, his whole body trembling as he stuttered his words. "Oh God. Oh God. It's happening. Is this really happening?" "Calm down, deputy," Tanya cried as she turned to face her partner. "We have a protocol for this scenario." "What should I do?" Mike exclaimed while still in a panic. "Sound the alarm." "Damn it," Tanya ordered. "We need to get the townsfolk to safety. I'm breaking so many of my own rules by posting this account on an online." Mike almost pissed his pants, but he complied with the order, shakingly pulling a key from his utility belt and running to the back room. I somehow made it back to the sheriff's station wagon parked at old Jerry's cabin, only to realize I didn't have the keys. I thought on my feet, gaining access to the late Gary's house and eventually finding the keys to his old Jeep Wrangler. The engine started on the 3rd attempt and I sped down the mountain road, determined to warn my neighbors of the coming danger. He woke up with wings, but as I drove, I once again heard the monster's blood-curdling roar, and when I looked up, I saw the beast in full flight and heading straight for the near-defenseless town of Jericho. I drove to the strip mall off Main Street, slamming the brakes on the Jeep and coming to an abrupt stop in the empty parking lot. All of the stores were closed and boarded up, as was the usual precaution on the day of the ritual. Only one unit had any signs of life, and that was the sheriff's office at the end of the row. I paused for a moment, my hand still grasping the steering wheel, as suddenly all my emotions spilled out at once. I screamed as tears ran down my cheeks and I slammed my fists against the dashboard. It wasn't supposed to go like this. No one was meant to die. For 50 years the ritual had gone without a hitch, but everything had gone to hell in one short morning. My best friend, his father, and 2 others were dead, and I couldn't process it. But this wasn't the time for grieving. The beast was coming, assuming it wasn't already here. I couldn't do anything for Nathan and the other casualties, but I could still save the others. Jessica was my priority, and my mother too. I had to get them somewhere safe before it was too late. Pulling myself together, I jumped out of the vehicle and jogged across the asphalt, wearily looking up into the sky, but seeing it was all clear. I burst into the sheriff's office and surprised the 3 persons inside. The 2 part-time deputies, Tanya and Mike, both jumped up whenever they saw me. I noticed how they both reached for their holsters, but the cops calmed down once they recognized me. And sitting at the back of the station room was Jessica. She was flicking through a magazine when I burst in, but her eyes lit up once she saw me. I noted how her expression changed in an instant as she picked up on my obvious distress. We both stood frozen for a long moment, and I couldn't find the words. How could I tell Jessica that her father and brother were dead? That I just stood and watched while they were slaughtered? In the end, it was Tanya who broke the silence, as she approached and placed a firm hand on my shoulder, asking, "Are you okay, kid?" I flinched at her touch, pulling away and reacting with anger. "No, I'm not fucking okay," I shouted. She frowned but didn't lose her patience. "What happened, kid?" Tanya asked sternly. I opened my mouth but found the words stuck in my throat. Eventually, I managed to splutter out what felt like a confession. The ritual failed, it's got loose. I saw Tanya's eyes widen in terror at the news, although her reaction wasn't as bad as her partner's. Mike, the second deputy, flew into an instant panic, his whole body trembling as he stuttered his words. Oh God. Oh God. It's happening. Is this really happening? Calm down, deputy, Tanya cried as she turned to face her partner. We have a protocol for this scenario. What should I do? Mike exclaimed while still in a panic. Sound the alarm. Damn it, Tanya ordered. We need to get the townsfolk to safety. I'm breaking so many of my own rules by posting this account on an online. Mike almost pissed his pants, but he complied with the order, shakingly pulling a key from his utility belt and running to the back room. While this was happening, Jessica ran forward and grabbed me by the shoulders, forcing me to look her in the eye. Then, what the hell happened? She asked frantically. Where are my dad and brother? I didn't want to be the one to tell her. Who the hell wants to break news like that? But yet I had to. I'm so sorry, Jess, I spluttered. They didn't make it. I saw the hurt in Jessica's eyes as something inside of her broke. She started to shake her head vigorously as if in denial. I wanted to hug her so tight, but we were suddenly interrupted. Hey Jessica, here's your brother now. I guess he made it after all, said Tanya. I turned around in annoyance and confusion, glancing back towards the doorway to where the cop was looking. And when I saw the figure standing there, my blood froze. It was Nathan, or at least that's what I thought at first glance. The figure had Nathan's physique, his hair, and was even wearing his clothes. But this wasn't my friend. His skin was pale white and his eyes unnaturally black. And that cruel, hideous smile, I'd seen it before, in the very recent past. The monster in Nathan's form stared at me for a brief moment before turning its attentions towards Tanya. Then it darted forward, extending its fangs in a lightning attack. Tanya let out a gasp as she went for her gun, but the beast was far too quick. In an instant, the monster grabbed a tight hold of Tanya and plunged its fangs deep into her throat. Jessica screamed and I broke from my paralysis, taking her hand and running towards the door. But the beast was soon done with Tanya, her blood still dripping from its maw as it blocked our path and let out a thunderous roar. At that moment, the siren sounded and temporarily drowned out all other sounds, warning the town of the imminent threat. Seconds later, and Mike came back into the room, reacting with horror when he saw his dead partner on the floor and the monster who'd invaded the police station. Holy shit, Mike mouthed, as he went for his gun. To Mike's credit, he managed to draw his revolver and fire 2 shots, both hitting his target in the chest. The beast stumbled, but the bullets only wounded it, and the monster inevitably reacted with fury. It roared so loudly it could be heard over the siren, before unleashing a stream of white fire, engulfing the deputy and burning him alive. The dying man screamed in total agony, and the beast stumbled as its strength temporarily faltered. I took the opportunity, holding Jessica's hand tightly as we ran out of the sheriff's office and across the parking lot. Oh my God. Oh my God, Jessica repeated while still in a state of shock. It's real. The monster is real. We hid behind a parked car, just long enough to catch our breath. Is it dead? Jessica asked, her eyes still wide with pure terror. No, I replied solemnly. Bullets won't kill it. Once the beast feeds, it will be back to full strength. What are we going to do? She asked desperately. We need to get to the church. It's the 5th rule. Remember. But first I need to go home and get my mom. Seriously? Jessica responded in surprise. Yeah, I confirmed. She can be a bitch, but she's still my mother. I can't leave her to face that thing alone. Okay then, let's go, Jessica replied, and we set off, darting down the main street as the warning sirens blared all across our besieged town. I feared the worst when we approached the dilapidated bungalow, which I called home, and found the front door wide open. Jessica tried to hold me back, but I broke away, bursting through the doorway as I called out my mother's name. I quickly searched every room in the small house but found no sign of her. The television set was on, but it showed nothing but black and white static. Frowning, I picked up the remote and flicked through the channels, but I could not find a single one which worked. Was the beast disrupting the broadcast? Was this even possible? How powerful was this entity? I was rummaging through the drawers in my mother's bedroom when Jessica gave me a shock as she approached me from behind. "Where's your mom?" she asked in concern. "I don't know," was my honest answer. I completed my search of the drawers, frustrated when I couldn't find what I was looking for. "The gun's gone," I said, referring to the 9mm pistol my mother kept in her room. "Well, your mom probably went to the church when she heard the siren," Jessica suggested. "Yeah, maybe," I replied as I looked down at the worn carpet. But I didn't believe it. I knew the church was the last place my mother would go in an emergency. But clearly she wasn't here, and there was no point in hanging around. "We've got to call someone," Jessica said firmly, her teary eyes suddenly filled with a fiery defiance. "We need help. Who can we call?" I asked in frustration. "All the cops are gone." I regretted the words as soon as I spoke them, seeing the hurt in Jessica's eyes as I reminded the girl of her father's death. But she didn't back down. "Fine," she exclaimed. "Then we call the state police. Or the damn National Guard. We can't deal with this alone, Ben." I hesitated. It wasn't a written rule, but we'd always dealt with our own problems here in Jericho. Due to our unique circumstances, we preferred to keep to our own. But every system we had in place was failing, and so I took Jessica's point. Moving into the kitchen, I found the phone already off the hook. Lifting the receiver, I heard a familiar voice on the other end. "Benjamin, is that you, son?" "Mom?" I replied in confusion. "Where are you?" "I'm calling from the old ranger station in the woods. The monster's after me. Please, son, I need your help." I experienced a terrifying sense of déjà vu as I recalled how Nathan had been lured to his death. A sudden anger came over me as I spoke through clenched teeth. "You're not my mother." There was a brief pause on the other end before the beast laughed, emitting a chilling, inhuman cackle down the line. "Clever boy," it said in a deep and raspy voice. "Not that clever, though. You should have listened to your mommy and ran away. But now there's no escape. You and your little girlfriend are mine for the taking. Just like the rest of the scum in this town. I've waited a long time for this day, and my revenge will be so sweet." With that, there was a high-pitched screeching down the phone which forced me to drop the receiver as I covered my ears. "Ben," Jessica cried in concern. "What's wrong?" I slammed the receiver down to end the malicious call before turning to a frightened Jessica. It seemed that the beast had taken control of every method of communication, cutting us off from the outside world. To my mind, this left only one option. "We need to get to the church," I said firmly whilst looking Jessica straight in the eye. "It's our only chance." And so we left my childhood home and fled across town, heading for what we hoped would be our sanctuary. Our sprint across Jericho was frantic and terrifying. We quickly realized that the beast had recovered from its gunshot wounds and was continuing its assault upon the town. We heard random firing and many screams as we ran, glancing to the east and seeing multiple houses burning under the demon's unholy fire. And then we looked up to the smoke-filled skies and saw it, the beast in full fall, cackling with a twisted glee as it observed the devastation from above. Jessica paused for just a moment, frozen in awe-struck terror as she cast her eyes upon the winged monstrosity, now in its true form, and no longer taking the appearance of her late brother. Suddenly, the beast turned in our direction, its dark eyes filling with a murderous zeal before it let out a predatory roar. A chill ran up my spine as I took a firm hold of Jessica's hand and screamed in her ear, "Run." We sprinted as fast as our legs would carry us across the dead ground. The church was close, we could see the front door and steps leading up to it. But the winged beast was closing the gap fast. We could hear the heavy flapping of its vast wings and the grinding of its sharp fangs. I was panting heavily and my legs were burning. I'm sure Jessica was just as exhausted. But we couldn't stop, we would not give up. We reached the steps. The beast was right above us. But I thought we were going to make it. But to my horror, I saw the church door slowly start to close. "Wait," I screamed frantically. I saw a bald head and pair of terrified eyes emerging from behind the door, and recognized the man as Chuck, our town's resident butcher. He wasn't looking at us, but rather at the flying beast, which was only a few feet above us. For a horrifying moment, I thought Chuck would shut the door and leave us to our fate. But instead he unveiled a shotgun and aimed it above our heads, firing and hitting the monster with buckshot. The beast shrieked in pain and temporarily retreated, and a moment later, We pushed our way inside, Jessica first and me a split second later. We heard the monster roar in angry frustration and acted quickly, joining with Chuck to slam the heavy door shut and lock it securely. I half expected the monster to crash against the church door, but it seemed to have abandoned his attack, for now at least. We heard another screech and observed the beast through the barred windows as it soared back into the blue summer sky. I took a moment to catch my breath before checking on Jessica to make sure she wasn't hurt. We'd survived by the skin of our teeth and made it to the town's sanctuary, and now at least we could enjoy a brief respite. I looked around the church hall and saw many of our friends and neighbors were already here, men, women and children, entire families huddled together with shock and terror in their eyes. And yet, there were so many missing. I estimated that only half of the townsfolk were present, and maybe less. That's when the terrifying reality hit home. If only half the town was here, that meant the rest were still outside and at the mercy of the beast. From where I stood in relative safety, I could hear screams and desperate shouts as our people fought for their lives. Worse still, my mom wasn't here, which meant she must still be out there, assuming she wasn't already dead. Below the altar stood Pastor Eddie, still dressed in his ceremonial white robes. Although his plump face was now pale and drained of blood, he remained silent, nodding intently as his wife spoke in his ear. I noticed how Yasmin had either lost or removed her blonde wig, showing her true hair, short and cropped. I also saw the fire in her eyes as she whispered God knows what to her impressionable husband, and that look scared the hell out of me. There was a nearly unbearable tension inside of the hall, exasperated by a stink of sweat, blood and fear. Before long I noticed that many eyes were looking in my direction, casting hard glares as they whispered to each other suspiciously. I felt very self-conscious, and I think Jessica noticed the atmosphere too, because she came in close and held my hand. But the crowd was clearly turning against me as men stood up and started marching threateningly towards us. And amongst their number were Billy and Randy, the town bullies who'd harassed us the night before. We'd humiliated them yesterday evening, but now the boys saw the chance for revenge, their cruel eyes lighting up as they approached. I turned to face the bullies, but suddenly felt a firm hand on my shoulder, spinning around to see Chuck the Butcher, his bloodshot eyes wide and his shotgun thankfully slung over his shoulder as he confronted me. "You were at the ritual, kid. The only one who made it back. What the hell happened out there?" I realized then what this was. They blamed me for all that had happened, blamed me because the beast had escaped and was now laying waste to our town. And what could I say in my defense? My lips were dry as I opened my mouth and spluttered my response. The beast, it tricked us. The monster killed the sheriff and mayor before we could stop it. "I'm so sorry, but there was nothing I could do," Chuck scoffed in disgust. "For 56 years the ritual's gone smoothly, and then you come along and screw it all up." "That's not true." Jessica cried out in my defense. "Ben isn't to blame for this. He's a traitor, just like his daddy." That was Randy, a twisted grin on his lips as he relished the opportunity to attack me. We were now surrounded and our former neighbors were in danger of turning into a lynch mob. In desperation, I turned towards the pastor, silently pleading for his help. But the holy man seemed taken aback by this turn of events. He just stood there, his eyes wide with shock and his body frozen. In the end, it was his wife who spoke, but she did nothing to calm the situation. Quite the opposite, in fact. This young man was the only one to return alive from the ritual site. She repeated, "There are questions he must answer." "Yeah," cried out Billy, as he drew a Bowie knife from his jacket pocket. "That son of a bitch has to pay." There were roars of agreement from the angry crowd as they closed in on us. Jessica pulled me in tighter and shouted out emotionally, "Stop it. Leave him alone. I love him," she cried. There were shocked gasps from the mob. "Harlot," shouted Yasmin from the far side of the hall. "Or," added a male voice from the back. "That's sick," Billy exclaimed. "He's like your brother." Jessica meant well. Well, but her confession had only poured fuel on the fire. The crowd had surrounded us now, and I genuinely feared they would rip us to shreds before the beast got the chance. But thankfully, Pastor Eddie finally intervened, shouting over the rowdy mob as he called out for calm. "Now, people, my good people of Jericho, we cannot turn on each other in this dark hour. The real enemy is the demon outside of our doors. His words were uncharacteristically strong and seemed to have the desired effect. As the tension decreased and the mob started to move away, but the bullies refused to back down. What about them? Randy asked spitefully as he continued to glare at Jessica and me. Are we just going to let them get away with it? The pastor opened his mouth to speak, but before he got a chance, his wife tugged on his arm and whispered in his ear. I saw the pastor's facial expression change in an instant as he listened carefully to his wife's words. I couldn't hear what Yasmin said, but was sure it was pure poison. Eventually, Pastor Eddie cleared his throat before speaking with less certainty. Well, I think given the circumstances it would be better for this young couple to be held until the situation is under control and we can establish the truth. I'd remained silent up to this point but had reached my limit. Wait a moment. You can't do this, I exclaimed. But it was already too late. As Chuck, Billy, Randy and several others grabbed hold of Jessica and me, practically dragging us kicking and screaming towards the altar. Lock them up in the rectory, Yasmin ordered. As clearly she'd taken command of the situation, the mob did as instructed, shoving us inside of the small room. Randy grinned and waved just before slamming the door shut and locking it from the other side. I banged on the door and shouted all the obscenities under the sun, but eventually Jessica asked me to stop. We expected the church to come under attack at any moment, but I guess the demon was biding its time. Or perhaps it just enjoyed toying with us, its prey. In any event, it seemed we were in as much danger from our so-called friends and neighbors than we were from the monster outside. Jessica and I spoke for hours during that afternoon in captivity. At first our conversation was tense and fearful, but in time we moved on to brighter subject matters and remembered the good times we'd had growing up together. I shouldn't have said it like that, Jessica said as she stared deeply into my eyes. But I really do love you, Ben. I want you to know that, in case we don't make it. I smiled as a tear rolled down my cheek. I love you too, Jess. And we're going to survive this. Trust me. I wasn't convinced and I don't think she was either. But we embraced and kissed passionately. And for a moment I truly did believe we might make it. But our intimate moment was rudely interrupted as we heard the jingling of keys and the lock and the door being opened. I was disgusted to see the sneering bullies staring in at us, both armed with knives and with a grim-faced mob standing in the corridor behind them. Sorry to interrupt. Love birds, Billy said sarcastically. Fuck you. I shot back angrily. Come on, Romeo, Randy added. It's time for your close-up. With that, the mob piled into the small room, once again taking hold of Jessica and me before they frog-marched us back through the corridor and into the church hall. And to my horror, I saw they were taking us straight towards the front door, which was now wide open. Jessica started screaming and I kicked and fought with all my might, but to no avail. They pushed us past the huddled congregation, some of whom shouted abuse while others just stood back and watched. But no one tried to help us. It was like we were unclean and being cast out of our own community. Before long we were outside. It was dusk now and we could see the summer sun setting against a pink horizon. But the coming darkness was lit up by dozens of fires burning all across town, as Jericho was literally burnt to the ground. All it had taken was a few short hours for the monster to lay waste to our community. Across the street from the church were the charred remains of two of our former neighbors, both burnt beyond recognition. The foul stench of burnt flesh hung in the air as I wretched and once again fought in vain against my captors. There were tears in my eyes as I witnessed the horrific scene, and I guessed that hundreds of townspeople had already died in the inferno, all because we'd failed to complete the ritual. I felt sick to my stomach and stopped struggling against my captors to the point where they had to drag me along the sidewalk. I glanced over at Jessica and saw she was still fighting like hell. Her family might be gone, but she didn't want to join them. But what were the mob going to do to us? I soon got my answer. Several men secured Jessica and me to a pair of lampposts along the street, binding our hands and ankles tightly and securing us to the posts. With this job done, the majority of the crowd left the street and returned to the church hall, leaving behind a group of 5 to guard us: Pastor Eddie, Yasmin, Chuck, Billy and Randy. Chuck was still carrying his pump-action shotgun while Billy and Randy both held their Bowie knives as they grinned menacingly. The pastor and his wife weren't armed as far as I could tell, but this hardly mattered, as Jessica and I were both securely tied and effectively helpless. What the fuck is this? Jessica cried out in fury. Why are you doing this to us? We are enacting the 6th rule, Yasmin replied with a smug and sadistic smile set on her ruby lips. The sixth rule, I repeated in confusion. The 5 rules of the church had been drummed into us since we were old enough to read, but never had I had mention of a 6th. Yasmin left it to her husband to explain, although I noticed how he couldn't look us in the eye as he spoke, and I could hear the shame in his voice. Yes, I'm afraid there is a 6th and final rule which my ancestor left for his descendants under the strict understanding that it would only apply in the most desperate of situations. We came close to implementing this rule in 42 until Gary Baker led the successful fight back. But now, regrettably, it seems we are out of options. I felt the fear pulsating through me, and I struggled to speak through my trembling lips. But I did manage to ask the $1,000 question. What is the 6th rule? I muttered. The pastor lowered his head, unable to answer. But his wife was more than happy to reveal the terrible truth. Rule 6 comes into effect when all else fails, she explained in an almost gleeful tone. You see, Franklin White understood the heavy price required to defend our town and our people. If the beast gets loose and cannot be stopped by force, the only way to pacify it is through a blood sacrifice. I felt a sickness in the pit of my stomach as the horrifying reality hit home, and turning to Jessica, I saw her face had turned a ghostly shade of pale as she struggled to speak. You can't be serious, she cried. I'm so sorry, answered the pastor in shame. There's no other way. Don't apologize to them, spat Yasmin as she chastised her increasingly feeble husband. They deserve their fate. She pointed at me accusingly before continuing. He comes from bad blood, and it shows. How many of our people have died because of his failure? I lowered my head in shame, because on some level I did feel responsible for the ritual failing. But then the pastor's wife turned her attentions on Jessica. And this harlot has sullied herself and brought shame on her family name. Go to hell, you evil witch, Jessica spat, her eyes filled with a righteous fury. But Yasmin merely laughed. You don't need her, I pleaded. If there must be a sacrifice, let it be me. You can let Jessica go. No, Yasmin snapped back. There needs to be 2. I didn't know whether she was telling the truth. Hell, for all I knew. Yasmin had invented the entire 6th rule for her own twisted purposes. But either way, it was clear we were in serious trouble. Screw it. Randy swore as he butted in. Let's get this done. What's first? First, we make them bleed, answered Yasmin. The smell will draw in the beast. Randy smiled sadistically as he approached Jessica, knife in hand. No, I screamed. Leave her alone. You son of a bitch. I struggled desperately against the ropes, but my binds were too tight. I could only watch in impotent horror as the knife drew closer to Jessica's skin. It seemed we were both doomed, but rescue came in the most unlikely form. Get the hell away from her, came the shrill cry. I turned my head in that direction and was astonished to see my own mother. Her bloodshot eyes wild but determined as she wielded a handgun and aimed at our captors. Randy stopped in his tracks, freezing when he saw the gun. Next. My mother turned the weapon on Chuck while shouting, "Drop it. Throw your gun down or I'll blow you away." Chuck hesitated for a second before tossing his shotgun down on the asphalt. Next. Mom barked out instructions to Billy and Randy. Cut my son loose. The girl too. It was at this point that Yasmin attempted to intervene, saying, "You don't want to do this, Bella. You're making a big mistake." "Shut the hell up," Mom screamed. "Cut them loose." The 2 bullies didn't move as they looked to Yasmin for assurance. But my mother acted aggressively, raising the gun in the air and firing a warning shot. "Do it now," she cried. Okay, Randy shouted. And a moment later, the 2 boys used their knives to cut Jessica and I free. I wasn't clear what would happen next. The best plan was for the 3 of us to get the hell out of there while we still could. Yasmin seemed frozen following the gunshot. But surprisingly, her usually docile husband stepped forward, slowly walking towards my mother with his hands outstretched. "Please, Bella, this is not the way," he said calmly. "You have strayed from the righteous path, but it's never too late to come back to the flock. Stay the fuck away from me, you psycho." My mother spat angrily, but the pastor was undeterred as he continued his slow approach. "Give me the gun, Isabella." For a terrifying moment I thought my mom might comply. But then I saw something break in her eyes widening and lips curling as she squeezed the trigger. There followed an almighty bang as the bullet tore through the pastor's skull and his brains were splattered all over the sidewalk. No, Yasmin screamed in a gut-wrenching wail of grief. My jaw dropped as I was shocked by the violent act. But there was no time to process the killing as events moved so quickly. A moment after the pastor's body, Chuck Fell went for the shotgun, but Mom was too fast for him, shooting the butcher 3 times in the chest. It was then that I jumped into action, running forward to grab the dropped shotgun. But simultaneously, Randy charged forward, screaming blue murder with his knife in hand. "You bitch," he screamed, as he stabbed my mother deep in her stomach. I watched my mom bleeding heavily as she collapsed to the tarmac. "No," I screamed, and I reacted with fury, smashing Randy's head in with the butt of my shotgun. Suddenly there was another cry from behind me. I swung around and saw Billy charging towards me, his eyes full of fury as he wielded his blade. Without thinking, I aimed the shotgun and fired, blowing Billy away at near point-blank range. I watched as the kid's body was flung backwards and was instantly horrified by what I'd done. But my attention was soon captured by Jessica's screams. When I lifted my head, I saw Yasmin had her. The late pastor's wife had pulled a concealed dagger and was holding it against my lover's throat. "Let her go," I demanded. "Drop your gun," she shot back. We were at an impasse. I couldn't shoot Yasmin without hitting Jessica, and she knew it. But the attack came like a bolt out of the blue as the beast descended from the twilight, screeching in fiendish anticipation as it dug its claws into Yasmin's flesh. The pastor's wife screamed as she let go of Jessica, allowing my beloved to escape into my waiting arms. Meanwhile, the winged beast tightened its deadly grip upon its victim, using its mighty strength to physically pull her up into the air. Yasmin continued to kick and scream in a blind panic as the demon ascended with her in its deadly grasp. It must have flown to a height of 50 or 60 feet before releasing its victim. Yasmin was still screaming as she fell, but her neck snapped like a twig once she hit the tarmac, and then the woman was finally silent. Jessica and I retreated as the beast soared into the darkening skies above us. We went to my mother's aid, only to find she'd lost a lot of blood, her face drained as she was unable to get to her feet. "Run," she cried. "You two need to get the hell out of here." "I won't leave you, Mom," I answered emotionally. "You have to," she replied as her strength faltered. "You must survive, otherwise it's all been for nothing." "Ben," Jessica cried out. "He's coming back." I looked up in time to see the beast descend and land on the sidewalk just down the street from us. Its black eyes filled with a murderous zeal as it opened its horrifying maw. At that moment, Randy regained consciousness, having only been stunned by the blow to his head. He unwittingly staggered towards the monster and screamed when he saw the beast towering over him, and the demon wasted no time as it unleashed a stream of fire, engulfing the kid in unholy flames. "Go now," my mother ordered. "I'll hold him off." Jessica took my hand, and then we were running down the street, fleeing once again from impending doom. I turned my head for only a moment, watching as the beast approached my wounded mother. Mom raised her pistol and prepared to shoot, but at the last moment she turned the gun on herself, pulling the trigger and ending her own life. Tears rolled down my cheeks as I witnessed my mother's death. Despite all her faults, she'd sacrificed herself to save me. Just after the gunshot, the beast roared in anger, clearly frustrated that he'd missed the opportunity to burn its victim alive. I was sure it would turn on us next, but instead the monster turned its attention towards the church hall. Someone inside had unwisely opened the front door, probably to investigate the gunshots, and now the demon had an opening as it soared across the tarmac and entered the building, soon turning the church hall into a slaughterhouse. We heard the blood-curdling screams but knew there wasn't a thing we could do for those people. And so we fled, sprinting through the burnt-out remains of our town and entering the forest beyond. It was dark now, with the only illumination coming from the moon and the stars above. Jessica and I knew these woods well, but we'd never had to navigate them after dark. That had been one of the rules after all. We had a plan of sorts, aiming to get to the road leading westwards and to hitch a ride to safety. But as we fled deeper into the dark woods, I heard the ominous silence and had the terrifying realization that we were being hunted. Suddenly a voice called out from behind us, a familiar and initially comforting voice. "Jess? Ben? Where are you guys?" Come out. It's safe now. It was the sheriff's voice. Or so it seemed at first. Daddy, Jessica called out hopefully. Don't, I whispered in her ear. It's not him. But it was already too late. The beast had found us. I saw its pale form emerge from behind the trees, striding towards us with its claws extended and its blood-soaked maw hanging open. I went for the shotgun which I was carrying over my shoulder, but the monster was so fast, and the forest floor shook as it charged towards me. Jessica cried out, pushing me out of the way at the last possible moment. The furious beast lashed out, cutting Jessica deep through her chest as she fell backwards. Meanwhile, I grabbed the shotgun and fired at the beast, forcing it back. I couldn't kill the monster but could certainly hurt it, and that was good enough. I reloaded and fired again, experiencing a grim satisfaction as the buckshot tore through the beast's pale flesh and it squealed in pain. I continued firing until all my shells were expended, and the beast retreated back behind the trees to lick its wounds. I dropped the shotgun and ran to Jessica's aid. She was still breathing and conscious, but the claw wounds across her chest were severe. I couldn't tell just how bad it was in the dark, but it was clear that Jess couldn't walk, and so I mustered my strength and lifted her, carrying my beloved's broken body as I continued our retreat through the woods. Thankfully, the road was closer than I'd thought. Once I reached it, I laid Jessica gently down on the grass and held her carefully as I tried to stem the bleeding and keep her conscious. It must have been about 10 minutes before I saw headlights coming from the opposite direction. I jumped onto the road, waving frantically and almost getting myself run down by the pickup truck which stopped at the last possible moment. "What the hell are you doing, kid?" screamed the driver, a middle-aged man with a beer belly who wore a leather jacket and baseball cap. "Please. My girlfriend is badly hurt. We need to get her to a hospital," I pleaded. The driver came with me and helped me carry Jessica to the back cab of his truck. Jesus, he swore upon seeing the deep wounds on her body. Did a bear do that to her? I didn't answer, instead repeating my plea with increased urgency. "Please. We have to go. There isn't much time." "Okay," said the driver as he put his foot down on the accelerator. We must have driven for another 5 or 10 minutes before I came to a terrible realization. Jessica was bleeding out and we weren't going to make it to the hospital in time. My beloved wasn't going to make it. I held her tighter and tried to hold off my tears. But then I saw the light in her eyes fading as she managed a final smile and whispered, "I love you." "I love you too, Jess. Forever," I replied emotionally. But I didn't know whether she heard me or not, because her eyes closed and she stopped breathing. An unstoppable stream of tears ran down my cheeks as I held onto Jessica's now lifeless body. "My God," swore the driver in shocked disbelief. But he was looking out of the car window and towards the fires which had engulfed my former hometown. And then we heard the thunderous roar of the beast carrying through the night air as the demon let out its hideous cry of victory. And so that's my tragic story, warts and all. You may think I'm telling you this to gain sympathy, but that's not the case. I'm writing this down because I'm the only one who knows the truth of what happened during that blood-soaked summer of '98. I've kept this tragedy a secret for so many years, but no longer, because I'm going back to face the monster head-on. It never went away, you see. Jericho wasn't rebuilt, but the area around the mountain has been the site of many unexplained incidents over the last 26 years, including multiple disappearances, alleged animal attacks, and mysterious fires. Clearly, the monster still dwells in the mountain, emerging every summer to hunt, feed, and cause bloody mayhem. This evil has been left unchecked for too long, but its time is up. I've collected an arsenal of weapons, ammunition, and explosives, and tomorrow I'm driving up the mountain to where this all began. My plan is to finish the ritual and trap the beast, for good this time. 26 years ago, this monster took everything from me, but now I'm going to make it pay, even if it costs me my mortal life. Jeff the Killer reboot. The day Jeffrey Woods and his family arrived at their new home, the sky was overcast and the weather was muggy. The gray skies seemed to punctuate his mood. Jeff was not thrilled to be here. Their new home was beautiful, though, a true example of his father's newfound success. But still, it wasn't the home he'd known. A week after they'd settled in, Jeff and Luyu woke up early. The sky was a crisp and gorgeous blue, and although the Louisiana heat was playing its usual cruel tricks, the brothers decided that a morning bike ride to explore the area would be just the right ticket to combat the slight pangs of homesickness that they'd both been experiencing over the last week. "I miss home," Liu blurted out, as Jeff was smearing salsa on the microwave burrito that would serve as his breakfast. "Me too, Liu. But I guess this is home now. So we just sort of have to make the most of it." "I know, but all of our friends and stuff are back in New Orleans. Remember that building we'd always sneak up on top of and watch the city lights come on?" "I miss that," Liu responded, sounding down. "Yeah, and Zim Video. The owner knew us and would always let us rent our ratted movies without our parents. And he'd always hook us up with a free video game rental if we got a few movies, yeah. I miss that too. But Liu, we have to," Liu interrupted. "I know, we have to make the most out of this. But still, this place just seems so fake. And Mom and Dad still treat us like we aren't even here." "Yep. They do. I was sort of hoping the new house would improve their mood. But what can we do?" Liu had no answer. Jeff finished his breakfast and the two boys left the house to mount their bikes and explore around a bit more. As it turned out, the subdivision they moved into was rather close to a cluster of stores and a small shopping center. Village Shopping Center was the name of the short row of businesses. Within these were a Pizza Hut, a Chinese restaurant, a tobacco store, a Sprint store, and, what Jeff and Liu were most excited about, a video store. "We'll have to get Mom or Dad to come down here and open up an account so we can rent movies," Liu mentioned as Jeff flipped a box over to read the description of a horror movie. "Shit, you're right," Jeff snapped, feeling a bit of frustration at this thought. He knew getting his parents to actually come down here and set up a membership would take forever, since their usual after-work routine was to go off into separate rooms until they got hungry enough to come out and speak. Jeff glanced over at the girl working behind the counter. "Maybe I can go over there and sweet-talk her into giving us accounts," he joked. "Yeah, right, Jeff. One look at you and she'll probably ban us," Liu remarked back, a smile broad on his face. "You doubt me, little man. Doubt you. The guy who's kissed two girls and almost touched a boob. Never. Please go on over and lay on all the charm. Whatever. I totally could have banged that girl. But her parents came home and... Last time you told me that story, you said her parents were out of town and her sister came home." Jeff became flustered, and while in the process of trying to make yet another comeback, the girl behind the register removed all doubt by speaking to the boys herself. "Hey, aren't those your bikes?" the young woman asked, pointing towards the glass window. Jeff and Liu looked over and saw three boys outside, two of which were riding around in circles on the Woods brothers' bikes. They would spin them around and then jump off, letting the bikes crash onto the pavement, just to stand them up and ride them again. The two boys riding the bikes were both slim in build, while a heavier boy stood on the sidewalk, drinking a Red Bull and watching. Jeff and his brother made their way towards the doors of the video store. When the fat kid saw them coming, Jeff couldn't hear what he said to his two friends, but he made some sort of gesture while shouting, and the other two boys dumped the bikes where they lay and walked towards the sidewalk, directly towards the two brothers. "Those your bikes?" one of the boys asked as Jeff and Liu entered the summer heat. "Yeah. Why are you riding them?" Liu asked sharply. "We just saw them there, man. Relax. Figured someone just left them out for us," the same boy responded, as his two friends joined him on either side. Jeff, determined to make a good start here, tried to change the course of this confrontation. "Well, they're ours. We just moved here about a week ago. We live over on Fairmont Avenue, a few blocks from here. We were just checking out the neighborhood." Jeff hoped that a civil tone could turn things around, but he could tell by the insolent look on the kid's face that this was a difficult gamble. "Good for you. You moved somewhere," the fat kid remarked. "Oh yeah, Troy." The first boy spoke. "They moved into that piece of shit house with the gravel driveway. I was wondering who would move into that place. Well, Randy, now we know." "Oh," the big kid, apparently named Troy, replied. Jeff, still trying to salvage the conversation, tried peaceful banter one more time. "Okay, so you're Troy and you're Randy. Well, I'm Jeff and this is my brother Liu. We just moved here from New Orleans. You ain't in New Orleans now. The third boy, who'd just now decided to speak, remarked. Yeah, and who the fuck said you could call us by our names? Randy asked. That insolent, privileged smile never leaving his face. Jeff smiled and responded to Randy. Well, I guess I could have called you a fucking asshole, but I figured I would give you the benefit of the doubt. In that moment, a flare of rage replaced the smirk that had rested on Randy's face throughout this entire exchange. The other two boys, Troy and the still unknown third member of his band, seemed to be momentarily struck silent. Perhaps they weren't used to being stood up to. Oh, I'm sorry. Was that language too adult for you? Jeff asked. And you, quiet boy. We know this isn't New Orleans, Jeff stated to the slim kid that had reminded him of his geographical locations. Because if this was New Orleans, you three would already have gotten your asses kicked for touching someone else's shit. The slim kid looked back and forth at his two friends. However, Randy, clearly the leader, seemed to know what to say. Keith, you gonna let this little bitch talk to you like that? Jeff knew this part, and while he wanted quite badly to sock Randy and his pals around, a real concern suddenly invaded his mind. If he and Lou got into a fight on their first week in this new Nessus, their parents would freak. He could practically hear it now. And while things had been far from perfect in their home, even after the move, there was a peace that had fallen over the family. And Jeff, fighting his urges, decided to do his best to keep it. Jeff looked over the three, very well dressed, very privileged looking suburban kids before them, and dismissed them. You guys are boring. Come on, Leo. Let them continue their play dates without us. Lou laughed at that and followed behind his brother towards the bikes. However, Arden, Randy and his little gang of would-be toughs would have none of that. They moved to block Jeff and his brother once again. Where you going, pussy? Randy asked, shoving Jeff. Jeff could tell that shove had no real conviction. Randy was trying to figure him out. Seeing where his buttons were, he'd push harder eventually. But Jeff swallowed the slowly building anger within him once more. Lou took a bit more exception to the shove. We're going to your mom's house. Me and my brother saved up a couple dollars from doing chores, and we hear she doesn't charge much. As the words left Lou's mouth, Randy appeared to only register a small portion of it all. Randy Hayden had grown up in Mandeville. His father was a partner at a local firm that made a lot of money, something else that Jeff would soon come to learn. Randy and his friends, while the same age as Jeff, had grown up in very different circumstances. They were used to being listened to. They were used to being feared. In fact, Randy, the target of the insult, just stood there. It was actually Troy, the fat kid who stepped forward, fist balled, eyes squinted in anger. Who you talking to? Troy shouted, and took a wild swing at Lou. Who was both in better shape and had sparred with Jeff a time or two during his time spent boxing, was able to avoid the punch, but just barely. Had that been all, it may have once again ended there. Troy was clearly taken by surprise at Liu's speed, and actually didn't attempt another punch. However, these were bullies, kids that ran in a pack for a reason. The skinny one, Keith, stepped around and threw a punch that connected with the left side of Liu's face. Jeff had seen enough. He'd been shocked at how quickly this evolved into blows, even though he'd expected it from almost the start. When he'd first met Randy and his friends, he'd been curious. From there, he'd developed an annoyance with them, and slowly that annoyance had evolved into anger. However, upon seeing Liu punched, seeing the small trickle of blood form on his brother's lower lip, upon seeing the smug look of satisfaction on Keith's face, that anger that Jeff felt suddenly exploded into a rage that he'd never felt before in his life. Jeff Woods did not hesitate. He stepped forward, his feet automatically falling into the correct stance that he'd learned from the boxing classes his father once enrolled him into, and delivered a powerful right hand to Keith's face. The skinny boy had no time to register shock or pain. The punch caught him by surprise, and his knees buckled. Keith went down to the ground in a heap of confusion and dawning fear. Randy, the so-called leader here, was almost too shocked to move. He'd had quite a lot of experience starting fights, but no real time logged in losing them. He'd never felt control of a situation slip. He was used to being in charge. So now, Seeing one of his friends go down so quickly and easily left him in a state of shock that he had no idea how to address. Troy, on the other hand, seemed to have a plan. Throw another punch. He moved towards Jeff deceptively faster than his weight would seem to allow, and threw 2 equally fast punches. Jeff, however, had no problem sidestepping both attempts. Troy, seeming lost for actions, actually dropped his arms, as if to say, "Gee, what do I do now?" Jeff had the answer. He moved in, throwing 3 hooks to Troy's stomach. The hefty kid's eyes went as wide as pie pans. A fitting analogy, Jeff thought. He staggered back, clutching his throbbing stomach. Jeff wasted no time, and stepped in once more, fetching a sharp punch to the big kid's jaw, causing Troy to promptly fall on his ass. Jeff was reminded of King Hippo from the Punch-Out game he used to play. He couldn't help but smile. Jeff now turned his focus on Randy. He advanced on the boy, feeling something new forming inside of him. He still felt the anger, the rage actually, at the antics of these 3 assholes. They had the nerve to mess with their bikes, the nerve to insult 2 kids they'd never met before, and of course, the ultimate offense, touching his brother. However, mixed in with this rage was also a sweet, enjoyable pleasure. Not only was he kicking their asses, but he was loving every second of it. It was as though the joy of showing them up was perfectly blending with the rage he felt towards them. Together, it formed into a sadistic, controlled sense of power. That was, until Lou stepped in front of him. "Jeff, stop. That's enough." "Why stop now, Lou?" "They wanted this," Jeff replied in a flat voice that Lou had never heard come from his brother's mouth. "She's calling the cops." "Look," Lou shouted again. And this time, Jeff came back to reality long enough to listen. He glanced over at the video store clerk and saw her on the phone, talking frantically and pointing towards the parking lot. Suddenly, Jeff's strange sadistic haze collapsed, and he regained his former self. "Fuck. Let's go," he stated quickly, and he and Lou mounted their bikes and rode towards the parking lot exit. "Yeah, you better fucking run," Randy called behind them. Jeff and Lou paid no mind and pedaled away. A few blocks down the street, they dismounted their bikes and began to walk them together. At first, neither brother spoke. Then Lou broke the silence. "Jeff, thank you for standing up for me back there. Thank you." "Yeah, those guys were pieces of shit. They had it coming," Jeff replied, looking down at the street as they walked. What happened? I've never seen you like that before." "Just defending myself, Lou. What was I supposed to do? Let them beat you up? I bet they go to our school. I bet we'll see them there. And they won't forget this. Who cares? We didn't ask to move here. We didn't ask for any of this. Mom and Dad just wanted a bigger house in a nicer neighborhood, and we were along for the ride whether we liked it or not. Think I give a shit what these rich asshole kids think of us?" Jeff stated, and went back to looking at his feet. "Think we'll get in trouble?" Lou asked. "For what, defending ourselves?" "Yeah, I guess you're right, they did start it," Lou answered, and to the brothers, the matter was closed. However, things were far from over. They found that the trouble they believed they'd escaped was in fact waiting for them at their front door. Jeff and Lou saw the police cars well before they arrived at their driveway. 2 cop cars, both parked in front of their house. Both of them felt their stomachs drop, as they well knew why the police were there. The brothers entered the living room to see their parents sitting on the couch, the 2 cops standing up, leaning on the wall, writing in their notebooks. "What did you 2 do?" Shalia practically screeched as the 2 boys entered the house. Lou, younger and less centered than Jeff, began to fall on the defensive. "Some kids tried to jump us down by that video store. They were messing with our bikes, and when we went outside, they got in our faces." "That's not the way we heard it," Matt Woods interjected, his voice firm and ripe with anger and dissatisfaction. "No, Dad. That's what happened," Jeff began to explain. "We were down at Friendly Video, looking around the store, when these 3 kids started riding around on our bikes. All we did was walk outside, and the kids started talking trash to us, trying to provoke a fight. When we tried to leave, one of them punched Lou." Finally, one of the 2 cops spoke. His name tag read Williamson. "Boys, we have some serious complaints about the 2 of you. From what eyewitnesses at the shopping center say, you 2 started the confrontation with Randy and his friends. Jeff took notice at how familiar the cop's tone was when he said Randy's name. This was a small town after all, and there was a good chance that this cop coached Randy in Little League or drank beers with his dad. Hell, it was even possible that this cop could be an uncle to one of the bullies. No sir, Jeff replied, we didn't start it, they did. We just wanted our bikes, we just wanted to leave. They blocked us. Williamson continued. As though he'd heard nothing Jeff said, several witnesses, including the video store clerk, say that you swung first. They say that the boys were riding your bikes. But let me ask you this. Did you chain your bikes to anything? Or did you just leave them outside the store? What's that matter? Liu demanded. Well, son, if you just left your bikes lying around in the street, you can't exactly blame Randy and his friends for riding them. Now, can you? It'd be different had you secured them somehow, but you just left them there. Mom, Dad, you're not buying this crap, are you? You know me and Liu don't start fights, when have we ever? These three punks messed with us. And if you can't tell that these cops are taking their sides, then you need to open your eyes. Jeff knew he was skating on thin ice, but that rage, it demanded some sort of satisfaction. Jeffrey, do not speak about these officers in that tone of voice, and do not speak to us that way either. Now, it's pretty obvious that you two aren't happy here, that you miss your old home, but starting fights in the street isn't going to change anything. Jeff's mother snapped back. Listen, boys, you're lucky. None of the parents want to press charges. This will be reported as a simple scuffle between teenagers. But be advised, you're both on notice. This is a quiet town, not like New Orleans. We don't tolerate this sort of behavior over here. If you see Randy, Keith, or Troy, I highly suggest you tell them you're sorry. We'll be keeping an eye on both of you, so don't let this happen again. You don't want to have an arrest record, do you? Why? Which one is it, officer? That's it. Both of you go to your rooms. Matt Woods apparently found that he wasn't a mute after all, as he ordered his sons out of the room. Jeff and Lou walked up the stairs, however, they refused to hang their heads in shame or feel any regret. Neither of their parents spoke to them for the rest of that day. Jeff and Lou stayed upstairs, venting their shared frustration to each other. They'd been screwed over even at their young ages, they knew that. They took some solace in the fact that they at least hadn't been arrested or cited. But still, they saw what was really going on here. That cop, he was protecting Randy, Jeff whispered to his younger brother. No shit, his brother replied. We have to watch ourselves, we have to take care of each other. You saw it down there. Even our parents didn't stand up for us. Yeah, what the hell was up with that? Liu asked. Imagine their fucking image, that's what's up with it. All they care about is fitting in here. They want to make sure they blend in with the rest of the Stepford families. No more fighting. If we see Randy or his two fuckhead friends again, we just walk away, okay? But Jeff, you can kick the shit of them, why would we walk away? Liu asked. Because I can't kick the shit out of the cops, Liu. I can't kick the shit out of Mom and Dad, and that's what lit that. Fucking Randy and his pals are protected here, you and me were not. So, if we see them, just avoid them, okay, please? Liu nodded. I feel like a little bitch, though. I owe Keith for hitting me. No, you don't. I paid him back for that. And paid his fat friend, too. I hope they just leave us alone now. Jeff sighed. Jeff and Lou didn't hear from their parents for the rest of that day. They remained in their rooms late into the night, and finally came down to eat after they were sure their folks had gone to bed. Lou said that he felt relieved about that, but Jeff had a sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. Jeff was correct. The next morning, when the two brothers came downstairs together to eat breakfast, their parents were already sitting at the dining room table, staring at the boys, approving of nothing they saw. Sit down, Matt stated flatly. What's going on? Liu asked. Sit down, Matt stated again, anger dancing on the words. The boys complied without further question. Matt Woods began his diatribe. Whatever that was yesterday. Beating up some kids for touching your bikes. Mouthing off at the police. Disrespecting both me and your mother. That stops today. We didn't beat anyone up for touching our bikes, Jeff blurted. Shut up, Jeff. This is a one-way conversation. His father barked. That kid, Randy Hayden. His father is a partner at my firm. Did you know that? Did you even think about that when you were assaulting him over your godforsaken bike? You just didn't think. Did you, Jeff? Sheila added. How could I have known that? Matt continued. Well, I've spent the entire morning talking to his father on the phone. His dad is willing to let it all go. But shit, son. I have to deal with that at work now. Do you have any idea how much damage this could have done to me? To our family? Jeff felt that rage coming back, and fought with all his might to keep it stifled. Instead, he once more tried to appeal to the two adults' parental side. Mom, look at Lou's face. They split his lip. Can't you see? It's still swollen. Lou turned his head to better showcase the injury. My God, Jeff. So some kid played a little rough with your brother. Is that any reason to fight them? I wanted to make friends with some of the other families in this neighborhood, but thanks to you, I just don't know. No sooner could Jeff or his brother construct a proper defense than their father began speaking again. So, your mother and I have talked this through. Since there are only a couple weeks of summer vacation left, we've decided that Lou should spend the rest of the season at Aunt Marcy's place. We've already spoken to her, and she is willing to let him come out there and stay. Both Jeff and Lou were floored by this decision. Both boys began to protest at the same time, but they saw the look on their parents' faces. The decision was made. Why can't we both just go then? Jeff asked. A last-ditch effort to at least get away from his parents. Marcy doesn't want both of you there. She says you two are too rambunctious. And frankly, we agree. Sheila answered. And so it was. Lou was shuttled off to his aunt's place in Abita Springs, Louisiana, a place even smaller and duller than Mandeville, if one can believe that. Jeff watched his brother leave, and then walked back to his bedroom. He felt that rage. However, it began to feel almost pleasant to him. He couldn't explain it. He was furious at this turn of events. His parents had turned their backs on their own children. However, through it all, these new feelings he was experiencing weren't all terrible. This anger, for example, he could almost taste it. It felt like thick, sweet syrup, stirring around in him. Of course, he knew the extra ingredient that would complete the flavor. That satisfying joy he'd felt when he had Randy and his friends on the ropes the day prior, that mixed perfectly with the anger, to create some intoxicating product that Jeff almost craved now. He fell asleep lying on his bed, thinking about that syrup, that thick, viscous that seemed to work its way into the very fabric of his soul. He wanted it, yet he knew that it was destructive, and that nothing good could come from sampling it again. Several days passed, and tensions were high between Jeff and his parents. Without Lou around, there was nothing for him to do except sit in his room and play video games. He went outside but didn't venture far from home. He knew if Randy and his goons showed up again, it would likely result in another fight. For a few days, that worked well, and Jeff believed he could get through this. However, his mother changed all of that on an early Saturday morning. Jeff was awoken suddenly by sharp sunlight striking his face. He heard his mother humming, something that she rarely did, even in his half-sleeping state. He knew that humming was forced. She was doing it to wake him up, and figured the added sunlight would get things there even faster. When she noticed Jeff's eyes cracking open, she sauntered over to his bed and began speaking in a tone that simply oozed false joviality. At first, Jeff had refused. Could his mother be serious? Did she really expect him to go over and make friends with Randy? He was still in bed when his mother stopped her incessant humming long enough to tell him to get up and get dressed. Once he learned why, he'd told her no. No way in hell. However, his mother was a shrewd manipulator, and she'd know exactly what would get the job done. She promised Jeff that if he did this for her, went over and made it work with Randy, that Lou could come home the next day. She'd sandbagged Jeff right into the corner with that one. He'd no choice but to agree. A short time later, Jeff and his mother were pulling into Randy's driveway. Randy's mother answered the door. "Hi, you must be Jeff," she greeted. Jeff smiled wanly and confirmed that was in fact who he was. "Hello, I'm Sheila Woods. Nice to finally meet you in person," Jeff's mother announced, barging past her son and extending a hand to Randy's mother. "Sheila, so pleased to meet you. I'm Bridget Hayden. Sorry to hear that our boys had a little mishap the other day. You know how it is though with teenagers. Hormones going crazy and all. Randy never gets into fights. But he explained to me that Jeff and his brother are still new to the area and haven't quite learned how we do things in Mandeville yet. Isn't that right, Jeff? Jeff couldn't resist a small jab. Yeah. Sorry about that, Miss Hayden. Me and Lou had no idea that it was okay for your son and his friends and mess with our bikes without asking. Bridget. He gets that mouth from his father. Never knows when to shut up. How about you and I go in and have some coffee and you can tell me all the great gossip around Mandeville while our boys get to know each other the right way? Randy is in his room, Jeff. Upstairs. Second door to your left. I'm sure you'll hear the sound of his video games or something. Bridget stated with very little humor to her voice. Thank you, ma'am. Jeff answered, and entered the house. Jeff knocked and heard Randy answer with, Come in. Hey. So, I guess you heard. Our parents want us to hang out, get to know each other. Jeff stated with little conviction. Yeah, that's my mom all right. She doesn't like drama. Honestly, I think she worries too much. I mean, I'm cool if you're cool. Jeff sat down on the floor next to Randy and struck up a conversation. So, turns out your dad is my dad's boss. He freaked out about the fight in the parking lot. He was actually worried that he'd get fired or something. My dad is like everyone's boss. I fucking hate it. I think half the kids at my school talk to me because their parents are somehow connected to my dad's firm. Why do you hate it? Jeff asked. Because it's fake. This whole damn town is fake. You'll figure it out as you go. But trust me, everyone who lives here is just trying to pretend they're something else. My parents make me do all this shit. All the trophies and stuff. Just so they can brag. That's it. Jeff smiled. I know how you feel. My dad had me in boxing class a year ago because some co-worker of his had a brother that worked at the place or something. As soon as that guy quit, though, I was out of that gym the next week. I wish it was that easy. Randy responded, I hate playing baseball, but my dad will sure have me out there again next summer and the summer afterwards. It's like he knows I hate it, but wants to make sure I'm out there with his stupid company name on the back of my jersey. Randy, why did you and your friends fuck with our bikes the other day? I told you, this town is fake and boring as shit. There is nothing to do here. We have to find stuff to do. I mean, there are only so many times you can go hang out at the video store or ride the dirt paths in the woods. All the girls here are stuck up. All the stores close early. There's no mall and the movie theater is across town. We were just bored, man. So, sorry for that, I guess. It's cool. Jeff replied. I guess I'm sorry for two. Things went too far. You mean the fight? Randy asked. That shit was actually cool. Those guys, Keith and Troy, they just leech on because of my dad. It's like I told you. I'm pretty sure their parents make them hang out with me. The afternoon went on, and Jeff soon forgot that this was a mandatory arrangement. He actually started to find himself liking Randy. Sure. Their first encounter was a little sketchy, but he was coming around to the guy, finding that he wasn't so bad once his idiot friends were removed from the equation. About an hour later, things took a new turn. Jeff heard the twin pops of two car doors shutting in near unison, and then heard the engine start up. He dropped the game controller and peered out of Randy's bedroom window, just in time to see his mother and Randy's mother backing out of the driveway. Our parents are leaving, Jeff said. About time. I figured my mom would eventually talk your mom into going shopping, or going to get coffee, or something like that. Jeff heard Randy pause the game. Hey Jeff, come downstairs. I want to show you some cool stuff. Randy invited, and Jeff followed. Randy led Jeff out to the garage. It was hot in there, with the main door shut. The garage was well kept though, and Jeff observed stacks of magazines underneath a workbench, as well as tools and various other utility items stacked about, standing in the small, closed-in garage. With the late summer heat lingering about, Jeff began to feel a bit uneasy. Despite the fact that he and Randy had seemed to bond over the last few hours, Jeff couldn't ignore a sense that things were different now that the adults were gone. What did you want to show me? Jeff asked. Hold on. Let me get it, Randy replied, moving the magazines out to reveal a small, red box. Jeff watched as Randy removed the box and opened it. Check it out. My dad's flare gun, Randy announced, and waved the red, tubular gun about. Whoa, be careful with that, Jeff shouted, more out of shock than real concern. It's fine, dude. Don't be a pussy. It's not even loaded. Randy said. However, Jeff watched as he fished one of the flares out of a back compartment. Randy then continued to fiddle with the flare gun, popping it open and loading a flare. Now it's loaded. Oh, he announced. My dad showed me how to use this last year when we went out boating. Sometimes I take it out back and shoot flares at the trees. But maybe this time I don't need a tree. The change in Randy's voice and demeanor was impossible to ignore. Okay. Well, cool gun. Let's get back in the house though. It's hot out here. Plus, I'm getting hungry. What do you have to eat? However, as Jeff turned to walk through the small door leading back into the house, his path was suddenly blocked by two more familiar faces. Where are you going, Jeffy? The fat kid, Troy, blurted out, as he and Keith stepped forward into the garage. Took you two assholes long enough to get here. I've had to babysit this faggot all day, Randy shouted. A wicked joy was present in his words. Sorry, Randy, but Keith here had to mow his front yard before his parents would let him come out, Troy said, a sheepish tone to his voice. It's cool. We're here now, Keith said. What the fuck is going on? Jeff asked, staring at Randy. He noticed that Randy still had the flare gun in his hands. I'll tell you what's going on, Jeff. You owe Keith and Troy an apology for what you did. You sucker punched them, and then ran away. You didn't even have the balls to fight them fair. So now, you're going to pay them what you owe. I'm not going to fight you. Okay. I'm done with that shit, Jeff replied as he glanced about the room for an exit. You're right about that. You're not going to fight. You're going to stand there and let my boys get their licks in. Then I get mine. And when that's done, you get the fuck out of my house. I'll tell my mom that you got sick and walked home. And after that, if you see us again, you better walk the other way. I'm not going to stand here and get hit by you or your friends. So just let me go home. How about that? I'll tell my mom that we're cool and everyone wins. Okay? Jeff asked. Randy then raised the flare gun towards Jeff. No, you stay pussy. You stay and take your licks. Jeff felt that sensation once more. That sick, rich dark matter that swirled about inside of him. He could taste it now. It was heaven. In his mind, he imagined himself diving into it, swimming in it, letting it swallow him whole. He looked around and the sensation only grew. He saw Randy, standing there holding the flare gun. It was limp in his hands though, and the hammer was not cocked back. Jeff knew that Randy had no intention of firing it. He looked over at Keith, skinny and pathetic, a kid born to follow. Troy, fat and sweaty, breathing a bit heavy from his walk over. And of course, in the middle of it all, Jeff himself. He felt that pleasure begin to mix with the rage, forming the perfect product. He tried to avoid sampling it. He knew that only regret could come from indulging in it. However, when it was placed so close, when the aroma and the promise of that sweet savory flavor was only inches away, Jeff found that he could no more to stand against it than a ship in the ocean could stand against a typhoon. Jeff began to smile. Why are you smiling at me? You queer for me or something? Randy asked, a slight nervous tinge in his voice. Am I smiling, Randy? I guess it's because I'm just having so much fun, Jeff announced, and suddenly lunged towards the unprepared kid holding the flare gun. Jeff struck Randy once in the nose. Randy's arms dropped, yet he kept hold of the flare gun. Jeff, without even needing to look, realized that Troy and Keith had actually taken a step back, instead of advancing as they should have. Jeff delivered another strong blow to Randy's jaw, causing the boy to drop to the floor. Jeff now turned his attention to Troy and Keith, the two tough kids that had yet to actually make so much as a move in his direction. Troy actually backed up a step and stumbled over the stack of magazines that Randy had moved earlier. Jeff took this opportunity and stepped forward, once again introducing Troy's round belly to his fist. Troy tried to stay on his feet, but Jeff's punches, combined with the stumble over the magazines, caused Troy to fall back. landing hard and striking his head on the concrete slab that was the garage's floor. Keith was actually trying to back away. However, Jeff was currently standing between him and the only exit to the garage, since the carport door was closed. Jeff took 2 quick steps towards the skinny kid and felt the most intense joy at seeing Keith stagger backwards, knocking his back into the wall. That perfect blend of pleasure, control, and rage had come together. Jeff felt as though he was floating above the world, somewhere in his mind. He knew there would be hell to pay for this, but at that exact moment in time, he couldn't care less. He didn't care about Lou. He didn't care about being arrested, and he didn't care if his dad got fired. All he cared about, in that fraction of time, was hurting Keith. Keith tried to make a run for it, hoping to squeeze through the small gap between Jeff and the door. However, Jeff clipped him a hard right hand to his face, causing Keith to stagger back again. Jeff could see that his knees were buckling, and took full advantage. He moved in, pinning Keith to the wall, and began to deliver blow after blow to the skinny kid's stomach. Keith's eyes became as large as saucers. Once satisfied, Jeff stepped back and watched in demonic glee as Keith slowly slid down the wall. Gasping for air, Randy got back to his feet, but seemed to have no idea what to do. "We done now, Randy? We good? Or do you and your friends need more?" Jeff mocked. "No more. We're cool. How about you assholes?" Jeff asked. "It was Randy's idea," Keith said weakly. "Yeah, man. We didn't even want to." Troy agreed. The debate may have continued, but the sound of a returning car broke the tension. "Oh shit, my mom is back," Randy shouted, his voice cracking in a humorous way. It seemed that the previous tough guy had all but shrunk back to a scared child. "So, we'll just say that we were all hanging out," Keith replied. "No, the fucking flare gun. If she finds out that I messed with it." "Unscrewed. So put it back," Jeff suggested. That sensation of rage was fading again, and he felt control returning. "Yeah, grab the magazines, please," Randy begged. Jeff found that he rather liked that tone, that begging, whip-dog mentality. Jeff was paying no attention to Randy. He was down on the floor, calmly gathering the magazines. He didn't really care if Randy got in trouble or not. However, if his mother returned and found trouble, he feared that Lou may not be able to return home as promised. Everything else happened in a flash, both literally and figuratively. Randy, now in a panic over the trouble he'd be in if he was caught playing with the flare gun, had begun to sweat. As his hands frantically clawed over the gun, his thumbs pushed the hammer back. Unintentionally, he didn't even notice that the gun was cocked. He was turning it over in his hands, trying to quickly disarm it. He then heard the sound of keys in the front door. He knew that he had only seconds now to hide it. Everything else happened in slow motion. The gun slipped from Randy's sweaty hands as he'd attempted to rotate it once more. He saw it fall to the floor, seeming to float to the ground, rather than fall. Jeff, busy stacking the magazines, had only enough time to register Randy's shocked gasp. He turned to look in the boy's direction, just in time to see the bright red flare gun hit the floor. The gun discharged, launching a speeding ball of fire directly into Jeff's face. Jeff felt the hot flash of heat and pain tear across the left side of his face. After the initial registry of agony, there was no more thinking. Jeff began to scream, clutching the left side of his face and rolling around on the floor. For a while he forgot everything, as he was plunged into that dark, rich syrup once more, the rage almost serving to dull the pain. When he finally did come to a stable level of alertness, he realized he was in a hospital room. Half of his face was bandaged. He knew that much. He wanted to open his eyes and speak, let his family know he was awake. But the drugs still had a firm hold. He was awake, but not quite yet functioning. He could hear several familiar voices, though. "Is he going to be okay, doctor?" Jeff's mother asked. "Oh yes, ma'am. Your son will be fine. However, he will have a lengthy road to recovery and will need your support." The flare struck his face and caused third-degree burns on his left side. "How bad is the eye?" Jeff's father asked. "Hard to say at this point. He'll need to see an optometrist for further review." but the damage appears quite severe. And his face? What about his face? Jeff's mother asked, sounding deeply concerned. Well, we were able to clean and treat the injury in time. So you've no concern for infection or anything of that matter. We'll want him on antibiotics for a while. And he'll need to have the wound cleaned and dressed on a regular basis. But all in all, your son got very lucky. The damage could have been more severe. Doctor, his mother began again. What if there is permanent damage? What do we do about that? As I said, an optometrist will have to examine the eye. Sheila Woods interrupted the doctor, sounding more agitated than before. You're not listening. Not the eye. His face. What do we do to correct his face? She demanded. Well, ma'am, we have treated his face. Like I said, there shouldn't be a risk of infection so long as you. She cut him off again. Not the infection. His appearance. What can we do for that? Miss Woods, that's hardly a concern at this point. Once he is healed and back on his feet, you can possibly explore plastic surgery to repair some of the damage. But honestly, right now, we can't waste concern on how he looks. What is important is that your son is healthy. He can expect to be back home in a few days. Maybe sooner. Jeff's dad spoke again. Okay. Thank you, doctor. Can we have some time alone, please? My wife and I need to speak. Certainly, the doctor replied. Leo, why don't you go down to the hospital cafeteria and get yourself a snack? Matt Wood suggested. But I want to be here in case Jeff wakes up, Leo replied. Leo, they told us that Jeff is heavily medicated. They don't expect him to wake up any time tonight. So, just go. And if he does come around, we'll have you paged, Matt replied. Jeff heard the door open and close as Leo exited. His parents both let out a long shaky sigh. But Jeff was starting to believe it was not a sigh of relief, but rather one of stress. We're going to have to homeschool him now, Matt. That's just what it's going to be. We're going to have to keep him home. He heard his mother rant, her voice sounding frantic. What? I mean, he probably won't be able to start school right on time. But I doubt he'll miss a whole year, his father responded, trying to maintain a calmer voice. I'm not talking about that, Matt. I'm not worried about him missing a week or two of school. I mean his face, Matt. You heard what the doctor said. His face is going to be disfigured. Sheila argued back. We don't even know the full extent of the damage yet, Sheila. It could be minor. It could possibly heal. And you heard what he said. Plastic surgery could be an option in time. In time? What kind of time? A year. 2 years. And what about in the meantime? People are going to see him and they're going to talk. Is that what you want? He's going to be a pariah. You think anyone is going to want to have him around their kids? Jeff was hearing all of this, just letting it soak in. Slowly, as his mind absorbed the words, he felt that rage return. Sick, rich, dark, that syrup of raw, primal emotion. He wanted to scream at his mother, to tell her to shut up, that he was the one lying here. Half his face burned, blind in one eye. All thanks to her forcing him to go over to Randy's house. He wanted to ask her why she left, why she went off to go shopping, or have her nails done, or whatever it was that she did. He wanted to know why she'd leave him alone with a kid who just days before tried to jump him and his brother. He wanted to know how she could care more about his appearance than the fact that he was lying in the hospital. However, there was still so much more that he wanted to know as well. He wanted to know how much more his mother hated him, how much more she saw him now as how did she put it? A pariah. He wanted to continue to swim in the thick pool of dark hatred that was starting to form from the rage and anger. That was a new one now. Before it was anger. Then it was anger mixed with pleasure. But now it was anger mixed with hatred. And while he certainly longed to be free of it, while he most certainly preferred the false sense of love and concern he believed he'd heard from her before, he also wanted to test it out a bit more. He also began to wonder, how well would this new recipe blend with pleasure? How would it feel? Matt Woods began to speak again. I just can't believe he shot himself in the face with a flare gun. I always thought Jeff was more responsible than that. Don't even get me started on that. Shelley replied. I couldn't believe it when Randy and his friends explained to the medics and police how it all happened. Randy was just trying to show Jeff around his house and wanted to show him the collection of magazines his dad kept in the garage. You know, boys. He was probably hoping that a couple of playboys would be in there or something. Then he said Jeff found the box containing the flare gun and just wouldn't stop playing around with it. You should have heard those other boys, Matt. They told me that they practically begged Jeff to just put it down before he got hurt, but he just had to show off. I just don't know where we went wrong, Matt. I thought us moving out here to a nice quiet neighborhood would make everyone happy. Jeff, though, he just wants to fight us on everything. And while all that came together in Jeff's mind, he continued to swim in that black ichor of hatred and rage. The morphine drip added a nice touch of euphoria. Jeff could almost see himself plunging into the syrupy waters of hatred and emerging change. Each dip brought him so much twisted pleasure, and that was when he finally understood. He could sample the pleasure now, not because he was enjoying what was happening, but because he knew he could enjoy what was to come. Just as the doctor had predicted, Jeff was scheduled to go home a few days later. During his time at the hospital, he never asked to see his face. It wasn't until the last day that he finally asked for a mirror. The nurse had come in to change his bandages, as was the routine. She was a pleasant woman. She spoke to him, asked him how he was doing. He enjoyed her visits. So, on the final day, when she arrived to clean and dress his face, he asked to see himself. Are you sure, sweetheart? Would you like me to call in your parents first? She asked. No, thank you. Jeff replied. I think I want to see it for myself first, without them standing over me. I understand, she replied honestly, without a hint of pretension. Once the bandages were off, she handed him a small hand mirror. Would you like me to step out of the room? She asked. Jeff ignored her and looked at himself, taking stock of the damage. Sure enough, his face was a mess. The entire left side, at least. The flare struck him traveling upwards and burned a scar into his left cheek that extended to his eye. At first glance, it almost looked like he was smiling on that side. The scar was still bright red, and burned tissue spread out on either side. Once it arrived at his eye, the news did not get any better. His eye was white, just a lifeless bulb plugged into his face. He closed his right eye and found that he could see nothing from his left eye at all. The scar continued up the left side of his forehead. The damage was less severe there, however. The hair on the left side of his head was burned off, leaving a few strands to stick up here and there. Sorry, sweetie, but I have to put clean bandages on, she told him. Jeff smiled. It's okay. There will be plenty of time for me to admire myself later. There was no joy from his parents on the ride home, or upon arrival. They spoke very little. What are you talking about? Liu asked. One day, you'll see it too. This is what happens, though. This is what happens when it all falls down, Jeff said, still peeking behind his bandages. Jeff. I don't know what you're trying to say, Liu responded. Jeff didn't reply, though, and after several moments, Liu left him alone. Liu went down to his parents' bedroom and knocked on the door. What is it? The voice of his mother asked. Mom, I think Jeff is acting weird. You may want to come talk to him. Go away, Liu. Leave your mother alone. His father's voice answered. Liu, being young, had no other ideas, so he returned to his own bedroom. He didn't know that those would be the last words he'd ever hear his parents speak to him. That night, Shalia and Matt Woods awoke together, both being light sleepers. It took little to bring them out of slumber. The sudden removal of their blanket, as it was snatched from the bed, did the trick just fine. They awoke to see a small light coming from the half bath that was situated in their master bedroom. The door was cracked only slightly, and the light source was weak. They could make out a human shape, standing over their bed though. What is going on? Shelia grumbled, as their vision came into focus. They realized their son was standing before them. Matt reached over and flipped on the lamp next to their bed. Jeff was standing there, his bandages off, his disfigured face beaming down on them, with a long kitchen knife clutched in his right hand. What are you doing, son? Matt asked, his mind still trying to shake out the cobwebs of sleep. He's got a knife, Shelia screamed, grabbing at her husband's arm. Matt kept his composure though. Shelia, it's probably the painkillers. He likely got up and got disoriented. Relax for Christ's sake. Jeff tilted his head to one side, still not speaking. He stared hard at his father, slowly bringing the knife up, ensuring that he saw it well. Son, what are you doing? Matt asked. Scaring you, Jeff replied, with no emotion in his voice. Matt, do something, Shelia pleaded. Okay, son. I realize you've been through a lot, but you need to go back to bed. I'm going to call the doctor in the morning and… Jeff moved quickly across to his father's side of the bed, his head moving about, alternating between a normal-looking young man and the deformed ghoul that had been lurking in the shadows. Okay, son, you've scared me. Is that what you wanted? Matt asked, adjusting to the middle of the bed to put distance between himself and his son. Good, now I can start hurting you, Jeff spoke again with no emotion. His father had time to utter a single syllable, most likely to ask another question, to try and reason with his son. Jeff, however, gave him time to do no more than that. He lunged onto the bed, driving the knife into his father's stomach. Matt attempted to fend Jeff off, but the wound to his midsection rendered him into shock, and his arms fell to the side. Jeff could hear his mother screaming, but paid no mind. He wanted to finish with his father first. Removing the knife, Jeff stabbed down into his stomach 3 more times, quickly. His father gasped and coughed up blood. His body jerked and twitched each time the knife found its mark. After the 3rd time, Matt Woods lay still. Shelia had backed up against the headboard of the bed. She wanted to climb down, make a run for it, but she'd balled herself up between the headboard and the end table. In her frantic state of terror and confusion, she couldn't figure out how to do something as simple as dismount a bed. Jeff, why are you doing this to us? She asked feebly. Randy started it. You must have known that, but you ignored it. Liu had a busted lip. You must have seen that, but you ignored it. I was shot in the face with a flare gun, but you believed Randy. Why? So you could fit in? Jeff asked in a low, almost growling voice. No, baby. I believed you. It was just your father's job, and we're new here. And… Oh God, Jeff, please. His mother begged. Tell me about homeschool, Mom. Tell me all about how you don't want to send me out in public because of my face. Tell me how none of the other kids will want to be my friend, and how none of their parents will want to be yours. Tell me about that, Mom. Tell me how nice it's going to be. You homeschooling me. Jeff, please. I was just stressed. I was worried about you, that's all, please. I love you, Mom. I think you should take your own advice. You know, what you told Leo when we got home tonight. He wanted to do something nice to welcome me home. And do you remember what you told us to do instead? Jeff asked, as he now crawled over, cornering his mother on the bed. What did I say? She asked, the question coming out barely a whisper. Go to sleep, Jeff snarled, and drove the knife into his mother's chest. He stabbed her over and over again, and as he did, he finally found that perfect recipe, that heavenly blend, that rage, hate, and pleasure all mixed into one perfect formula. And for a while, Jeff became lost in it all. Jeff opened his brother's bedroom door, not surprised to find his brother asleep. He had dozed off with headphones in, so he slept through all the shouting. That was fine with Jeff. It was easier that Lou not have to hear all of that. Jeff sat down on his brother's bed and nudged him slightly. It took a moment, but Lou finally opened his eyes and looked up. Jeff removed his earphones for him. You're free now, Leo. He spoke softly. Jeff. What are you talking about? Leo mumbled, still half asleep. You'll see in the morning. I just wanted to let you know I love you. You've been my best friend. Remember that. Okay? Thanks. I love you too. Now. Let me go back to sleep, Leo replied, already dozing off again. Jeff smiled and stood up. As he left the room, he looked back at his sleeping brother one last time, before he vanished into the night. When science found God, I've never much cared for religion. I mean, it's interesting and all. The old parables and philosophic insights from people 2 millenniums removed from the present. I particularly enjoy the books of the Apocrypha and the Bible's magnum opus of Revelation. if for nothing else than the interesting stories. Even some of the tenets, like an emphasis on strong family bonds and moral stature, I can resonate with. But in terms of a giant omnipresent entity that created everything yet loves us unconditionally, watching our every move from unseen planes, I don't know about that. I still don't ascribe to a singular religious doctrine, but knowing what I know now, well, let's just say the title of atheist would be a little disingenuous. Staking my flag in that camp would contradict all the principles of which my life has been founded upon. Try as I may, I cannot in good faith deny or refute what I myself witnessed. Calling whatever we discovered God may in time prove a bit inaccurate, but there is no denying it. We found something. Science has at times become this sort of monolithic and infallible institution, one that suffers from the ostracization of fringe concepts that fail to breach the egotistic blockade. It is all too often wielded as a trump card to negate all that doesn't assimilate to the prevailing narrative. Too often outlandish claims are torn asunder because no metrics exist to properly digest them. For all the good it has brought, science is not and will not ever be an absolute. Nothing is. Absence of proof is not proof of absence, and what happened out there, in that lab deep below the streets of Stockholm, now stands as a testament in my life to all the ventures humanity has yet to embark upon. It serves as an anchor, and if ever I find myself drifting away into the blissful seas of cognitive dissonance, it is there to remind me how small and naive I truly am. I graduated from UCLA with a bachelor's in physics, and an incredible opportunity landed in my lap. One of my professors had put in a good word for me with a lab out of Stockholm. I was contacted and offered an internship, one of dozens to be extended the opportunity. I accepted the offer without a moment's hesitation. From there I uprooted my Californian lifestyle to move halfway around the world to the frigid north of Sweden. I was not prepared for the cold. Most of my summers were spent in a bikini, frolicking on the sandy beaches of Santa Monica and lounging in the sun. Sweden might as well have been another planet. Temperatures would plummet to a bone-chilling -30 in the winter. Lucky for me, though, I had a marvelous host family who helped me acclimate myself and integrate into Valhalla. I was brought onto the team and slowly began the arduous process of melding into the group. They were all incredibly kind and welcoming, but still the feeling of being woefully outclassed by my colleagues was thick as tar pitch. The project consisted of over 50 men and women, all of them among the best the world had to offer. They hailed from Germany, Japan, Poland, Hong Kong, South Korea, and many other sovereign states. It was a melting pot of some of the greatest minds I'd ever met. Seeing them in their element and marveling at the way their minds hurtled ascendant topics to delve straight to the cortex was altogether incredible, and more than a little intimidating. The express goal of the coalition was to study the behaviors of quarks, protons, and other particles in the subatomic realm to further decode the complex world of theoretic energy matrices. By extension, the group also allotted resources to develop tools for observing and decoding quantum entanglement and string theory. These principles were still in their infancy at the time, and none of us could have ever imagined the enormous magnitude of the things that were to come. The lab had its very own particle accelerator, which I myself pretty much obsessed over from day one. Most of the concrete data, however, was relayed from the lab in Geneva, home of the Large Hadron Collider. I even got to see the magnificent machine in person on a few occasions. One thing that has always staggered me is the amount of incredible achievements capable when the pursuit of knowledge guides the way. However, the complete polar opposite is also true, as curiosity without empathy all too often yields crimes against humanity. As you may already know, the Large Hadron Collider was the first machine capable of synthesizing the particle known as the Higgs boson. The machine is a particle accelerator built in a 27-kilometer loop. It uses a state of perpetual vacuum and temperature colder than that of outer space to accelerate particles to 99% the speed of light. These particles collide with one another, creating spectacular outbursts of radiation and results which are believed to be similar to that of the Big Bang on a much smaller scale. It is also through this process that the infamous Higgs boson can be synthesized. Some call it the God particle, but many physicists are not fond of the omnipotent moniker. It is in a way suitable, though, as it is ubiquitous and can spontaneously manifest or dematerialize through processes which are not yet entirely understood. It is a sort of bridge between matter and antimatter, the entity that binds the ethereal with the corporeal. It is the place between light and dark, hard to define, as once light ends, shadow begins, and vice versa. The exact moment of intersection is difficult to pinpoint, but there is a definitive moment, and that moment is the Higgs boson. It was once thought that matter could only exist in one place at a time. However, the particle slit test of our progenitors proved otherwise. A particle accelerator was used to eject electrons between one of two microscopic slits. They naturally assumed the electrons would pass through either slit A or slit B, and when directly observed, their premise was corroborated. However, when an imprint background was installed to bypass direct observation, they noticed a peculiar detail. The electrons produced what is known as a wave, or interference pattern on the imprint like ripples in a pond. This meant that the electrons were interfering with themselves while simultaneously passing through both and neither of the slits. It was at first thought to be a false negative, an outright impossibility, but thousands of repeated experiments all reached the same conclusion. There was no denying it anymore. Matter can exist in more than one place at a time, and reality is altered simply by perceiving it. The world of particle physics is a strange one, and one which we have only just begun to glimpse the majesty of. At times it may even require us to suspend our own limited human understanding of things, to contemplate things beyond our mind's comprehension. It was this idea which was the tabernacle of all the group was trying to achieve: to unravel the mysteries of the subatomic universe, and better understand reality itself. The group was funded magnificently, and state-of-the-art equipment was provided from lavish donors from all around the world. My contemporaries and I began to study the processes again from square one. This consisted primarily of monitoring the nature of particles and testing the same process over and over ad nauseum. Progress was slow, and many failures were soon under our belts. But you can't build a house without chopping down a few trees. It took years to decode part of the formula. But eventually we learned that the behavior of these particles could be predicted under certain pretenses. They could also, to a certain extent, be directed, programmed to inhabit separate locations at the same time, giving them the perceived ability to exist in two places at once. In reality, though, it was more akin to a transfer of locale via microscopic slits in the Higgs boson. We realized it was not a matter of traveling to, but instead traveling through the fabric of space itself. With electrical stimuli and coordinate-based geosynchronization, one could manipulate these particles to transfer locations faster than the blink of an eye. The machine used was primitive compared to later iterations, but its true potential was not lost on us for a moment. Time went on and the technique was further refined. Most readily in the distance were particles able to be transposed. It started as only a few nanometers, but eventually we could transfer particles several feet. It was through this process that blueprints for an entirely new type of machine were first devised. It was to be a machine unlike any before it. Instead of electrical stimuli sent through circuits and wires, it was transferred directly from one location to another. Wireless energy transposed through space. This greatly improved computing capabilities and allowed the machine to act and calculate much quicker than anything ever seen before. Initial ideals for the machine were skeptical at best, but as time went on, the real significance of its potential became apparent. When combined with a suitable processor and digital interface, it soon began decoding encryption and translating mathematic ciphers in a fraction of the time of anything seen before it. It didn't stop there, though. With a binary converter, it wasn't long before human physiology itself was soon able to be deciphered and converted into convenient little anagrams and simplistic formulas. This soon gave the machine the ability to replicate human tissue and organs from fetal stem cells. When given raw biomass, it could manufacture a duplicate heart or lung, one which was genetically indistinguishable from that of the donor's DNA. On one occasion, the machine even managed to regrow the arm of an amputee war veteran. Most of us thought it couldn't possibly work, that the nerve endings on the man's arms would be unable to be resuscitated after so long. But after 17 hours in surgery, when I saw the vet move his new fingers for the first time after transplant and cell resuscitation, I knew we had discovered something special. Diseases became able to be observed on a molecular level and eradicated before gestation. A virus or bacterial strain could be genetically reprogrammed to attack and destroy itself rather than the host. HPV, AIDS, the Black Death, the common cold, strep throat, gonorrhea, none of them stood a snowball's chance in hell against the unrivaled power of the machine. It could even reprogram human DNA to desired proportions, eliminating extra chromosomes and restoring neural pathways to reverse entropic cognitive illness like dementia and Parkinson's. Even pre-birth conditions like cerebral palsy and microcephaly were in the process of being all but eradicated. It wasn't just organic material either. The machine could take a block of carbon and alter its isotopes to create carbon-14 and elicit radioactivity. This proved interesting for further power possibilities as the machine demonstrated the potential for creating its own fuel source. But there was another more pertinent discovery. By changing the number of protons or neutrons in the atomic nucleus, the given element's atomic weight was altered, thereby turning it into another element altogether. The machine held the power to change the very building blocks of the universe itself. It could turn copper into gold, bromine into iodine. I think it was then that we first realized the scope of what it was that we had created. The applications for the machine seemed endless. It could write books, clone living organisms, and alter the very elements beneath our feet. It was the Philosopher's Stone, the Holy Grail, and the all-seeing eye in one convenient little package. The Deus Ex Machina. The world's very first quantum computer was born. One important distinction I would like to make. Despite the rumors, the quantum computer was not, in fact, an AI. It had computing power which was eons beyond that of a normal computer, and the ability to perform almost any task given to it, provided the necessary accommodations were implemented. For this reason, it was not allowed to make decisions for itself. Many in the group were justifiably nervous at the prospect of an artificial intelligence somehow gaining sentience and going rampant with the power of quantum manipulation. We really had no idea where our experimentation would lead us, and so the decision was made early on to prevent it from thinking on its own and going all Skynet on us. The computer was a beast of burden, happily doing any task given to it, but it was us that held the reins. That was when the bureaucratic troubles first began. A lot of donors for the project, and even a few of my fellow team members, had their own ideas on how to best utilize the machine. Every nation involved wanted it for themselves and had their own vision on how best to implement its capabilities. Several members of the coalition ended up leaving the project or being outright dismissed, promising to return with a battalion of lawyers at their back. One man was even caught attempting to smuggle data from the lab and detained to await prosecution. The reigning project overseer was also relieved of duty. In his place, Dr. Henrik Lundgren assumed the role of director of operations. Dr. Lundgren is a dear friend and a brilliant mind. That's what makes his fate lie so heavily on my heart. It's a tragedy what befell him, but I won't act as though he wasn't responsible for stoking the flames. Lundgren managed to settle the group down and unite a divided faction of researchers who all held their own agendas. He made the executive decision to keep the computer in the hands of the international team and continue to study it for continued data analysis and eventual replication. All those who didn't abide were dismissed or removed physically as the need arose. Lundgren had toiled for years on the development of the machine's virtual capabilities and decided it best to invest more heavily into it. It took months of development, but soon a fully functional Sims-esque program was up and running. The simulation was modeled to be an exact carbon copy of our own world and held all the coordinating pieces within it. All the people, animals, and nations. Augmented control apparatuses were then developed to allow us the ability to view the computer's creation firsthand. The simulation it created was so visceral that none could even perceive that they were in a simulation at all. Test subjects were exposed to their own loved ones within the program and could not distinguish them from their real-life counterparts. I even took it for a spin a few times. I was hooked up to the monitor via a neural cortex interface and had my mind rendered into the simulation. I awoke to the sights of sunlight peeking through my blinds and the sounds of cars outside. Around me on the walls were posters of Harry Potter, JoJo, and the X-Files, among countless others. I recognized immediately where I was. It was my childhood home, an apartment complex in Sacramento. The simulation was so detailed that even my old Raggedy Ann doll with the missing eye was there. My parents were both there and acted in accordance to how they would behave in real life. My dad even made new corny jokes in a fashion that suited his personality. It wasn't a memory though, it was an entirely new scenario, concocted by my mind and the quantum simulation. My parents are both deceased in real life, and getting to spend time with them again was indescribable. Even if they were just simulations, the experience was profoundly cathartic for me. I ended up leaving the simulation in tears, overwhelmed by the experience and the ability to speak with my parents once again. It even made dealing with their absence a little easier in the real world. After all, I could now speak to them anytime I wanted. I found myself never wanting to leave the Matrix. Dr. Lundgren subsequently questioned me about my experience, and I was all too happy to relay the things I had seen. He listened intently with simple occasional nods and one-word responses. His gray face wore a smile and cheeks dimpled in delight, but his eyes were far from the present and worried. We held a meeting with all staff members sometime after. Lundgren stood and paced in front of the group, silent and mind-swirling in thought. When he did finally speak, he held our undivided attention. He walked through all that our little group had managed to accomplish, and all the things we had learned on our journey, all the miracles unraveled and translated into digital coding, and all the advancements made. It was not a triumphant voice, however. It was somber, as if none of it truly mattered. He then first proposed his new theory. Here we were with an entire simulated universe at the tips of our fingers, a digital reality created and maintained by a machine we had built, a simulation which was so authentic that none could tell it apart from reality itself. And if we had the power to create that, how did we know that our own universe was not the result of the same process? How did we know our reality was not, in fact, a simulation? An unnerving silence befell the rest of the group as Lundgren concluded his epiphany. All in attendance seemed to silently contemplate the idea, with a noticeably nervous aura now lingering. There wasn't much said after that, but there didn't need to be. We had an entirely new goal. Upon returning for work the following day, I immediately noticed that several of our colleagues had abandoned the project without so much as a goodbye. Only 7 of us remained, among which was the prestigious Henrik Lundgren. He was changed, though. His upbeat optimism and inquisitive attitude reverted to an impatient, gibbering wreck of a man. He became hostile to prolonged questioning, and I could see the idea gnaw on his mind as he walked the tightrope between madness and genius. At times, he even appeared on the verge of psychosis. He would ramble and talk to himself, and pretty much stopped leaving the laboratory altogether. We set our sights on a new task: to dismantle and test the hypothesis of Lundgren, to develop an ability to break through the boundaries of our suspected simulation and peer beyond our own reality to glimpse whatever may lie on the other side. Nothing else seemed to matter anymore by that point. Life may be accidental, consciousness too. Hell, even complex organisms like human beings, the result of genetic evolution and a bit of luck. However, simulation is not accidental. It requires an immense amount of dedication, programming, and logistics, not to mention power and maintenance. The ability to synthesize digital worlds is not something learned or accomplished by accident. It takes time, resources, and brainpower to even attempt it, and even then it's no guarantee. The one concept that was off the table immediately was that the theorized simulation was the result of natural phenomenon or random cosmic alignment. If Lundgren's hypothesis was correct, and our universe was indeed a simulation, then someone or something had to be pulling the strings behind the veil. Powerful as the quantum computer was, even it did not have the ability to glimpse directly into higher dimensions. As stated before, it took commands only from us and could only perform tasks which we could coherently articulate to it. We realized rather early that directly viewing outside the boundaries of the universe was likely not possible. The only option was to send a message. Through remedial experimentation and dozens of ponderous sleepless nights, we finally had a breakthrough. Our reality is based on laws. Laws of motion, laws of attraction, laws of physics. These laws cannot be broken accidentally. But with quantum technology, they can be manipulated. Many believe that intelligent extraterrestrials were first alerted to humanity when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Ours was essentially the same idea, demonstrating that we had the capability to toil with the quantum world in hopes of eliciting a response from a higher being. If we could break or bend one of these laws of reality, then perhaps the orchestrator would be compelled to respond. One of the earlier discoveries we had made was that of the concept of reverse time. Time is a measurement of something that occurs, and without anything to observe, time is meaningless. The concept only makes sense when in the presence of matter. The two concepts of space and time are coterminous, like light and dark or hot and cold. One does not exist without the other. Where there is space, there is time. And where there is time, there must be space. The opposite of matter is not nothing, but antimatter. A true nothingness or void of anything substantial does not exist. It cannot exist based upon the nature of existence itself. Antimatter is the invisible material which operates unseen and fills all the gaps which matter does not. All of it held together by the Higgs boson. If an opposite of matter exists, then an opposite of time must as well. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and all reactions must remain proportional to force exerted. By utilizing the quantum computer, we had the ability to send protons back in time, sort of. We could make them exist where they once had not by using dark energy matrices and particle superpositioning to put them in two places at once. The discovery had actually been made sometime earlier, but never officially tested. It was restricted and marked as unapproachable, as many of our patrons were rightfully concerned by the prospect of unintentionally altering the past. Doing so could create a butterfly effect and wreak havoc upon the present. We were told vehemently that the reverse time experimentation was forbidden, but now we had a legitimate reason to take an interest. It took some convincing on our end, but eventually we were successful when we promised to unveil the greatest discovery yet. The parameters were set within the computer and the lab was prepped for the operation. A single seed of Dianthus caryophyllus was placed in a transparent reinforced container in the center of the room. The specimen was placed on damp resin paper, and several little green tendrils had sprouted from its shell. The idea was to reverse the symbiotic metabolism of the test subject and cause it to rapidly revert to a zygote state. The seed would be directed to perform its life cycle backwards, thereby contradicting the natural forward flow of life and time. The parameters were finished, and Lundgren stood by the machine. He glanced to each of us individually with a sullen demeanor and nervous twinkle in his eye. He looked to me last, and I nodded. Lundgren took a deep breath, adjusted his glasses, and flipped the switch. Immediately the tendrils within the seed began to retract. They disappeared within the shell soon after, and the seed shrunk until the point in which it was no longer visible. The computer alerted us that the task had been completed, and silence descended upon the crew. We stayed that way for several seconds until a commotion from the computer drew our attention. An array of flickering lights and sirens began to wail like banshees, indicating an error of some sort. Suddenly the seed reappeared and began to grow at an impossible rate. A mass of wriggling green tendrils erupted from the shell and pressed firmly against the case within seconds. It swelled within and the chamber violently ruptured a moment later, sending shards of glass catapulting throughout the room. I managed to duck away just in time, but others in the group were not so lucky. One man, Reginald Diabeck, was struck with a shard in the neck. The piece cut a gash across his throat, causing a thick crimson to spill forth from his gullet. He collapsed to the ground as others began to rush to his aid. Before we could reach him, the engorged serpentine appendages of the seed ensnared him, slithering around his neck and abdomen. Diabeck gurgled and terror filled his eyes as the green pythonic roots began to constrict him. I watched at a loss for words as Diabeck's wound sealed. His gray hair turned to a dark brown. The wrinkles on his forehead and bags below his eyes dissolved into his skin in a matter of seconds. The blackheads and liver spots on his cheeks soon followed suit. All of us watched stupefied as the process continued onward and Diabeck appeared to age backwards. Diabeck had to have been nearly 60 years old, but in a matter of moments he appeared as though he was a young man in his early 30s. He then went young adult, then juvenile, then teenager. Diabeck screamed in terror as his voice cracked from a gruff, raspy tone to a high-pitched prepubescent shriek. His body shrunk in his clothes and his extremities retracted within his coat. By the time we had reached him, he was gone. We didn't have time to gawk, as our stupor was interrupted by the computer blaring a warning siren, and a flickering plethora of lights designated an external problem of some sort. The display was a failsafe designed to protect the computer from malicious outside sources. Most of us thought the firewalls of the quantum computer were enough to prevent any attempted breach. But apparently we were wrong. One of my colleagues scrambled to the kill switch. He was poised to throw it, when he was halted by a sudden shout from Lundgren. Lundgren stood, eyes wide as dinner plates and mouth agape as he stared at the main monitor of the computer. The warning display had ceased, and only a single screen remained active. Upon it was displayed a single loading bar, with approximately 20% of it being filled in. This indicated only one thing: something was being downloaded. We immediately surmised that it must be a virus or other malware of some sort, a prospect once thought impossible based on the security measures of the computer, and yet the download persevered. All attempts made to restrict the download and halt its progress proved futile. We exchanged nervous glances with one another, torn on whether to pull the plug and save our creation from hostile insurgents, or allow it to continue to whatever ends. The call was eventually made by the investors outside the room, who had since been notified of the development. They demanded power be cut, and the machine be saved. The computer represented a colossal investment, and the cost to repair or replace it, if any damage were to ensue, was not something taken lightly. Begrudgingly, Lundgren followed orders and commanded shutdown protocol. It was done straight away, but the machine did not power down. It continued impossibly and without a direct power source sustaining it. Panic began to erupt from the lab, and power to the entire facility was ordered to be cut from the mainframe. It was done within seconds, and the room fell into darkness. The only light that remained was that of the main monitor as the download reached the halfway mark. The computer groaned and whirred under enormous duress as hundreds of fans shot to life to attempt to cool the Leviathan machine. We stood back, unable to make heads or tails of the development. There was simply no possible way the machine should have remained active, and yet it was. It continued to fill up the progress bar, powered by the fuel of some unknown outside source. With no other viable solutions at hand barring physical destruction of the computer itself, we could do nothing but await the culmination. The download finished several minutes later, and the room fell into pitch black. We deliberated for a moment before deciding our only recourse was to power up the computer once again. The mysterious file weighed in at an impressive 100,000 terabytes, enough to fill hundreds of normal hard drives, but just another drop in the ocean for the quantum computer. Once full mobility was achieved, a single never-before-seen prompt filled the screen. Unknown file type. Do you wish to execute the file? All attempts made to bypass the prompt failed. We quickly used a separate program on another screen to trace the file's origin, but to no avail. Now, there is no hiding from a quantum computer behind a proxy or VPN. It uses an algorithm-based process combined with a ping response speed to determine probable origin up to an accuracy of 99.99%. We're talking response time measured in millionths of a second, but for a quantum computer, it's like the ABCs. Sure, it gets it wrong once in every million attempts, the point being it always has a guess. This time, however, we received a new message. Unable to determine file origin. Lundgren took a step back and pondered the situation and wiped the beads of glistening sweat from his brow. With nothing else at our disposal, he realized there was only one option left, and so he gave one last command. Open it. The computer began to render the file, the process taking several minutes to complete. It was entirely in binary code, and eventually translated to a single message. Upon completion, 2 words in a white font sat silently amidst a black background. I never thought 2 simple words could have such lasting effects on my psyche. Those 2 words that have made me question everything I thought I ever knew. The computer fizzled out moments later and shut down. All of us just kind of left after that. I returned home, overwhelmed by the events and left with a mystic sense of terror instilled deep in my stomach. The following morning, I was called by one of the investors. He informed me that someone had broken into the lab late the previous night and sabotaged the operation. The lab was lit ablaze and soon reduced to a smoldering pile of ash, and the quantum computer was damaged beyond repair. Whoever had done it possessed a security card and seemed to know the exact process required to dismantle the automatic sprinkler system. Police held a single suspect in custody, a man who appeared as a neurotic mess in the center of a maniacal nervous breakdown. He was tried and convicted sometime later, and declared clinically insane. He was ordained to a mental health facility in northern Sweden, and it is there that he remains to this day. That man's name? Henrik Lundgren. I've never been able to properly assess just what it was that happened that day. The event has left me shaken and confused in more ways than I could possibly list. I don't suppose I'll ever be whole again, I just can't be. I know the truth, the reason for our meager existence. We had reached out far beyond, and something answered our call. Whether or not it was truly what we would call God, I can't say. But I will say, after what I saw happen to Diabeck and what became of Lundgren, I can't think of a better word for it. I think God is something we never could have imagined. It holds us all within the palm of its hand, and with a simple flick of the wrist, we would cease to be. There is no love, there is no salvation. There is only that which lies beyond the margins of reality, that which we have no possible hope of understanding. One thing is also certain, it is watching us, and it does not want us meddling in that which we have no business seeing. We are set amidst an ocean of infinite black seas, and it was not meant for us to travel far. That final message could not have been clearer, and any time I find myself drifting, I remember those two simple words relayed by the quantum computer in its last moments of life. Turn back.